somewhere in the dark, a question is already forming. Not the kind that demands an answer. The kind that simply opens like a door left ajar in a house you thought you knew completely. What if the not knowing is not the problem? Tonight, you may be lying here with something unresolved, a decision still unmade, a relationship whose outcome you cannot see, a version of your life that feels suspended between what was and what has not yet arrived. And somewhere underneath all of it, that persistent human ache, the need to know how things will turn out. You are not alone in this. Right now, in this same darkness, there are people on every continent lying awake with exactly this, not grief, not pain, but the particular weight of uncertainty, the future refusing to show its face. If you feel like it, leave one word in the comments tonight. Just one word for what you are carrying. Not knowing, waiting, afraid, suspended. Whatever word is true for you right now. No explanation needed. I spent a long time finding the stories for tonight, not the famous ones, not the ones you have likely heard before. These came from corners of the Buddhist world that rarely get told in English. And I chose them because they say the thing I most needed to hear on nights like this one. These stories are contemplative in nature, not medical or therapeutic advice. Over the next few hours, we will travel to 8th century Tibet, where a woman alone in the mountains learned to hide wisdom inside uncertainty itself. To the high plateau of Mongolia, where a master created beauty without knowing if anyone would ever find it. To the forests of Cambodia, the island of Java, and the mountain of Yen Tu in Vietnam, each carrying a teaching from the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, the Drukpa Kagyu lineage of Bhutan, the ancient Theravada forests of Sri Lanka and Cambodia, and the Truklam school of Vietnamese Thiền. Traditions rarely heard together, rarely heard at all in the Western world. Now let your body settle into whatever is beneath you. No need to force anything looser. Gravity will do that work. If your eyes want to close, let them close. If your breath wants to slow, it will slow on its own. You are allowed to rest inside the not knowing tonight. That is exactly where these stories begin. In the Nyingma tradition of Tibet, there is a practice of concealment. The great teachers of the 8th century, knowing that what they carried was vast and too fragile to survive, the political storms already gathering at the edges of the kingdom, took their most important teachings and hid them. They pressed scrolls into cliff faces. They sealed transmissions inside hollow statues. They encoded instructions in symbolic scripts and buried them beneath the floors of temples and inside the walls of mountain hermitages, trusting that the right person, in a future that none of them could see clearly, would find what was needed at exactly the moment it was needed most. This act of concealment required a quality that is genuinely difficult to name in any language. Not faith in any comfortable sense, not the confident expectation of a good outcome, not the reassuring certainty that the work will be received. Something closer to what the Nyingma tradition calls naked trust, the willingness to act with full attention and full sincerity in the complete absence of any guarantee that the action will matter. To write teachings that no one in your lifetime may read, to hide them inside a mountain and walk away. To pour everything you have learned into a vessel whose future is entirely unknown to you, and to let it go. The woman most credited with this work, with the vast labor of concealment that preserved the Nyingma lineage through the centuries of political upheaval that followed, was named Yeshe Tsogyal. Her name in Tibetan means something close to victorious ocean of wisdom. The Nyingma tradition holds her as the foremost female practitioner of Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet, the principal student and scribe of the great master Padmasambhava, the one who memorized his complete teachings and concealed them as terma, hidden treasures, across the landscape of Tibet for those who would come after. Whether every detail of her life belongs entirely to historical record or partly to the luminous territory of sacred narrative, what the tradition preserves about her speaks directly to this night and to anyone lying in this particular darkness. She spent years completely alone, in a cave, not knowing whether what she was doing would ever matter, and she stayed. The valley of Zhoto Tedro lies in the northeastern region of Tibet, a gorge of white limestone and dark granite cut between walls of rock so steep and so close together that in the deep winter the sun reaches the valley floor for only a few hours each day before the cliff faces swallow it again. A pale green river moves through boulders at the base of the gorge, the color of that particular river, a quality you find only at high altitude, where the glacial melt carries minerals that stain the water with a green so cold and clear it seems to produce its own light from beneath. The sound of the river from above is constant but distant, a low, continuous voice that becomes the background texture of everything present in sleep and in practice and in the long silences between. The cliff face on the north side of the gorge rises in uneven tiers, pitted with cave openings the size of doorways. In the highest of them, reached only by a series of handholds cut directly into bare rock, the path so steep that in wet weather it would be impassable. In ice weather, it would be dangerous. In any weather, it is not the kind of passage that suggests anyone has reason to go there. There is a cave known as Kiri Yangjong, the secret crystal cave. It was here that Yeshe Tsogyal entered retreat, alone. She had not arrived at this cave through ease or through the straightforward unfolding of a simple aspiration. She had been born into the aristocratic Kachin family of Tibet around the year 777, and from childhood had wanted nothing but the Dharma, not the life of a noble woman, not the marriages her family arranged and rearranged as her beauty and lineage attracted suitors of increasing wealth and status, not the silks and the servants and the carefully constructed future that her birth had begun assembling around her before she was old enough to refuse it. She had fled once, as a young woman, on foot, alone, into the wilderness of the Onfu tiger lair, surviving in cotton clothing on whatever fruit the forest offered, determined to practice and to be left to practice. She had been brought back by force, by men her family sent to find her. At 16, she had become a consort to the Emperor of Tibet, Trisong Detsen. And then, through the events that her liberation biography preserves in elaborate detail, she had been offered to the master Padmasambhava when he came to Tibet to establish the Buddhist lineage, had received his initiations and transmissions, had become his principal student, and had eventually been recognized as the holder of his complete lineage. She had been given everything, every transmission, every visualization practice, every mantra with its correct pronunciation and the precise sequence of its mental applications. She had received the teachings with the quality of memory that her tradition says was given to her by the goddess Sarasvati in a vision at the hermitage of Yamalung, a memory so complete and permanent that once she heard something, it was hers as entirely as her own heartbeat, never to be lost. The tradition says that she received the teachings as though the contents of one vessel were poured into another without a single drop escaping, and yet standing at the entrance of the cave at Zhoto Tedro, looking down at the pale river and the vertical gorge walls and the vast cold quiet of what she had committed herself to, She knew something that no transmission had prepared her for. Knowing and understanding are not the same thing. She had the map. She did not yet know the territory. And the territory she needed to know was entirely inside her, which made it the most uncertain territory possible. Because the interior of a mind has no edges you can trace with your hand, no landmarks you can name and point to, no distances you can measure. The cave was not welcoming. The floor was uneven bedrock with no softness anywhere in it. The walls carried moisture through the deep winter months, a cold that came not from the air but from the stone itself. A different quality of cold than weather, bone deep and patient, and entirely indifferent to any preference she might have about temperature. The entrance was low enough that she had to stoop to pass through it, and the interior space was barely sufficient for sleeping stretched out and for the small butter lamp she kept burning through the nights, its flame in constant slight motion from the drafts that found their way in through the rock, regardless of what was done to seal the cracks. She rose before dawn each morning. In the deep winter, before first light, the darkness outside the cave was the particular blue-black of high Tibet before any color, not merely the absence of light, but something with texture and density, as though the darkness was itself a substance that the coming day would have to work to displace. She began her prostrations in this darkness, counting on a small mala of worn wooden beads. The sound of her forehead touching the cold stone floor, the organizing rhythm of the pre-dawn hours, before the mind had fully assembled itself into its daily shape. Then she would sit. She would recite. She would enter the visualization practices that Padmasambhava had transmitted to her, calling the form of the deity up from the interior of her mind, the way a skilled painter might call up a complex image from deep memory, holding it stable, rendering it in detail, sustaining the full clarity of it against the mind's constant natural tendency to drift and simplify and compress and eventually collapse. She recited mantras until the syllables had long since separated from their literal meaning and become something the body knew without the mind's conscious participation, a vibration organized in the chest and the throat and the skull, a rhythm that the breath arranged itself around without being asked to. In the spaces between practices, the uncertainty appeared. It was not dramatic. It did not arrive with the sharp quality of crisis or the weight of catastrophe. It came quietly, in the way that the most persistent things come simply present when she returned from the depth of practice, waiting at the surface of awareness with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be and no particular deadline. A voice that was not quite a voice. A pressure that was not quite a feeling. Something that asked, in no particular language, how do you know this is working? How do you know you are practicing correctly and not practicing some elaborate version of your own error? How do you know after this many weeks, this many months, alone on the face of a cliff above a river in a country that has largely forgotten you exist, that any of this will ever become what your teacher said it could become? She had no answers to these questions. This is what the Namthar preserves most honestly about the years at Zhoto Tedro. She did not receive convenient visions that resolved her doubt at exactly the moment it threatened to overwhelm her. She did not receive confirmation delivered with perfect timing. What she had was the breath, the stone floor, the flame of the lamp trembling slightly in the cold air, the body, which was still here, still rising before dawn, still pressing its forehead to the rock, still sitting and reciting and attempting, morning after morning, to hold the visualization stable for one breath longer than it held the day before. On the 15th day, something arrived that the Nyingma tradition calls a demon. In the language of Vajrayana practice, A demon is not necessarily a creature from another realm. It is the mind's own concentrated force, its resistance and its fear and its doubt given temporary form, coherent enough to be encountered directly, which is, strangely, a form of gift. A formless, unnamed unease is very difficult to work with. Something that takes a shape and speaks can at least be addressed. What arrived at the entrance of the cave that evening was reasonable. It was polite. It wore the costume of good sense and common practicality. It said, "You are not making progress." It said, "Your teacher may have been mistaken about your capacity." It said, "You are alone, and no one is watching. And therefore, nothing you do here is real, because what cannot be witnessed cannot be real, and what cannot be measured cannot have value. And what you are doing here in this cave can be neither witnessed nor measured from outside. So perhaps it is simply nothing at all, the elaborate ritual of a person persisting out of stubbornness rather than wisdom." She did not argue. She had been taught enough to understand that argument with a demon is a form of agreement, that to engage with its reasoning is to grant it the solidity it requires to continue. She noticed the voice. She noticed that it was a voice. She noticed that she was the one noticing, and that the one doing the noticing was not the same as the voice, was not the same as the fear the voice had generated in her chest. Was something prior to both, something that had been present before the voice arrived and would remain present after the voice dissolved. She returned to her breath, not because the breath was the answer, not because returning to the breath resolved the uncertainty or proved the demon wrong or confirmed that she was practicing correctly. She returned to the breath because it was the one thing she could be certain was actually happening right now. Air entering the body, leaving the body, entering again. This had been true before the demon appeared. It remained true while the demon spoke. It would be true after the demon dissolved. The breath asked nothing of her except her presence. It did not require her certainty. It did not require her to have understood anything, achieved anything, proven anything to anyone. It only required that she be here for it. The demon stayed for 3 days. Then it dissolved not through being defeated or argued into silence, but through being outlasted. Through the simple practice of continuing to return to what was actually present rather than to what was being insisted upon. She remained at Zhoto Tedro for 3 years. The tradition records that she came close to death several times during those years, that there were periods of extreme cold and deprivation when the boundary between her body and the stone of the cave floor became genuinely uncertain, the cold no longer distinct from her own temperature, the darkness of the cave no longer easily distinguishable from what was behind her own closed eyes. That there were nights when the uncertainty opened so wide beneath her that she had nothing at all to stand on, no achievement she could point to, no confirmation that anything she was doing was registering anywhere, no visible sign that these years of her life were different from simply sitting in a cold room in a forgotten corner of a country consumed by its own political upheaval, and that she stayed, not because the uncertainty resolved, not because certainty finally arrived in a form she could hold. She stayed because she had discovered slowly, through failure more than through success, through the accumulation of mornings that offered nothing except the next morning, that the not knowing was not the obstacle she had been trying to push through. The not knowing was the practice itself. The willingness to remain inside it without demanding that it change its shape before she could continue that willingness was the deepest form of the work she had come to the cave to do. Years later, students traveled great distances to find her. They came carrying their own uncertainty in the way people carry things they have been holding for too long, slightly hunched under it. slightly breathless, looking for someone to take it from them or tell them it will soon be over. They said, "I do not know if I am practicing correctly. I do not know if the path leads where I hope. I cannot tell the difference between genuine progress and the convincing illusion of progress that a determined person can construct for themselves over years of effort." She gave them the same answer each time. She said, "Stay. Not stay until you understand. Not stay until the uncertainty lifts and the path becomes legible and the confirmation arrives. Stay inside the uncertainty itself. Learn to breathe inside it. Let it become familiar, the way the cold stone of the cave floor became familiar to her, not comfortable, but known. Not pleasant, but no longer alien. And as it becomes familiar, something shifts. Not the uncertainty remains. What shifts is your relationship to it. It stops presenting itself as a gap through which you might fall and begins to feel more like the actual ground, the only ground there is for any of us. The ground that everyone stands on, whether they acknowledge it or not. What Yeshe Tsogyal found at the end of her 3 years in the cave was not a resolution of not knowing. She emerged, having become smaller in one particular way, having set down the demand that she understand before she could continue, and in that setting down found something that had been present the entire time, beneath all the practices and the memorized transmissions and the carefully constructed frameworks of understanding. Something that does not depend on certainty. Something that was present before the cave and would remain after the cave was empty, and the cliff face had changed its shape through centuries of weather. She called it the self-originating clear light. The awareness that does not need to be made, that is present before knowledge arrives and remains after knowledge dissolves. The one element in the entire architecture of practice that cannot be achieved because it was never absent. This matters tonight because you are not so different from the woman in the cave. The uncertainty you are carrying, the unresolved question, the future that has not revealed itself, the decision that has no clear answer, the outcome you cannot see, no matter how many times you turn it over, it is not evidence that something has gone wrong with you or with your life. It is not evidence that you have failed to prepare sufficiently or think clearly enough or care deeply enough. It is evidence that you are alive, that the future is genuinely open, that you have not yet reached the end of the story. And that is not a problem. That is simply the condition of being a living person in the middle of a life that is not finished yet. The mind treats uncertainty as if it were an emergency that must be resolved before rest is permitted. But look at the cave at Zhoto Tedro. Look at the woman who spent 3 years there without resolution, without confirmation, without any guarantee that what she was doing mattered, and noticed that the rest was available to her anyway. Not the rest of having figured everything out. The rest of being exactly where she was, with exactly what she had, making exactly the next small movement that was available to her. That rest is available to you tonight too. Not because the uncertainty has lifted, because you are still breathing. Because the body, when nothing is being demanded of it, already knows how to soften. The breath does not make that uncertainty disappear. What it does is something different and more practical. It gives you a place to stand inside it. A rhythm that asks nothing except your presence. A movement that has been accompanying you through every uncertainty you have ever survived, every night that seemed impossible to move through, and then was moved through. Every morning that arrived after a night you were not sure you could endure. The breath was there through all of it. It is here now. It does not require your certainty. It only requires that you allow it. That you stop asking the darkness to explain itself and simply feel the weight of the body, held, the air, moving. This moment, complete in itself, even without resolution. Feel your shoulders now wherever they are. Whatever they have been holding, let them drop a little. Let gravity do what it knows how to do. There is nothing up there that needs to be kept up by your shoulders tonight. The ceiling is not your responsibility. The future is not your responsibility tonight. What is available tonight is only this breath completing itself. And then the next one, in and out. Carrying you through the not knowing, the way that pale green river carries the cold of its glacier through the gorge at Zhoto Tedro, not resisting what it carries. Not pretending to be warmer than it is. Simply moving through the dark toward whatever the morning will bring. Just this breath moving. Just this body held. Just this moment in which nothing is certain and everything that needs to be here is here. And as the cave of this night becomes less like confinement and more like shelter, as the not knowing softens from something frightening into something simply present, we travel now toward another story. Across a vast stretch of continent from Tibet to the high plateau of Central Asia, where a man spent 30 years inside a cold stone workshop learning that beauty does not require the maker's certainty in order to exist. From the forests of Mongolia, where a mountain called the Red Throne stands above the Orian Valley, and where, inside a small workshop near its summit, 30 years of patient attention were poured into things whose outcome could never be known in advance. If sleep is coming for you, let it come. The stories will find you wherever you are. High above the Orian Valley in central Mongolia, on the rocky summit of a mountain, the local people called Shiriti Ulan, Ul, the Red Throne Mountain, there was a place so remote that in winter the wind came straight off the steppe without anything to stop it, crossing thousands of miles of open grassland before it met the mountain's face and turned upward along the cliff. In summer, the larches that covered the lower slopes grew so dense and close together that a man walking among them lost sight of the sky entirely, and the only indication of the sun was the quality of green light shifting through the canopy above him, now bright, now dim, moving with the slow indifference of Wajaliyutiya that has no particular interest in any single creature beneath it. At 2,400 meters above sea level, where the forest thinned and the rock became visible through the roots of the last trees, a small collection of wooden structures occupied the summit of the Red Throne Mountain. The largest was a meditation hall barely large enough for 20 people. Behind it, connected by a stone corridor no wider than a man's shoulders, was a workshop. This workshop was Zanabaza's real home for 30 years, more his home than the mobile palace tent that traveled with him across the steppe, more his home than the great monastery of Erdeni Zoo in the valley below, more his home than the formal reception halls where he met with khans and emperors and the representatives of distant courts. The workshop on the mountain was where he came when he needed to think, and where he created the works that 3 centuries later would still be standing in museum cases across Mongolia, their bronze faces carrying expressions that visitors from many countries have found impossible to fully describe. He built this place when he was 14 years old. At the time, he was already the Onda Gegin, the High Saint, the first spiritual leader of Buddhism for the Khalkha Mongols of Outer Mongolia. He had been recognized at 4 years old and enthroned at 5, proclaimed by a convocation of Khalkha nobles to be the living incarnation of a great Tibetan scholar saint. By the time he was 14, he had spent a decade being treated as the answer to questions he had not yet thought to ask. He was born in the year 1635, the second son of the Tushit, Khan, whose lineage ran in an unbroken thread back to Genghis Khan. His family's blood was the most certain thing about him, the most mapped, the most documented, the most surrounded by people who had already decided who he was and what he would become. By the age of 3, he had been observed reciting Buddhist prayers that no one had taught him. By 4, he was building small temples from stones in the courtyard and conducting imaginary teaching ceremonies for the birds and the servants' children who would watch him from a respectful distance. There was, from the very beginning, a quality in him that the adults around him found simultaneously reassuring and slightly difficult to hold. At 15, he journeyed to Lhasa. The journey from Kulka, Mongolia to Tibet took months across open steppe, through mountain passes where the altitude turned the sky a deep blue that had no equivalent at lower elevations, along trade routes that wound through landscapes barely touched by the idea of permanence. He arrived in Lhasa thin and deeply attentive, and the 5th Dalai Lama recognized him as the reincarnation of Taranatha, the great Tibetan scholar and traveler. He spent years in study in Tibet, absorbing not only the religious transmissions that were the formal purpose of his journey, but also the artistic traditions that were flourishing there, the sculptural styles of Nepal and Tibet, the precise iconographic canons that governed how the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas were represented in 3 dimensions, the metallurgical techniques that allowed those representations to be cast in bronze and gilt copper and gilded brass. He returned to Mongolia at 19 with 40 skilled artists in his retinue. He was carrying, inside him, everything the finest Buddhist artistic education in the world had given him. And he was carrying, alongside it, the beginning of a question that his years of study had not answered and would not answer for a long time yet. What does it mean to create something when you cannot know in advance whether it will succeed? The monastery on the Red Throne Mountain was where he spent the next 3 decades finding out. The workshop's walls were stone, unplastered, the gaps chinked with dried grass and clay that the winter cold found its way through regardless. The floor was packed earth, covered in places with worn felt rugs. A single high window faced south toward the valley, and on clear days, the light that came through it in the mornings had a quality peculiar to high altitude, thin and very clean, carrying an almost crystalline quality that made the shadows it cast look more precise than shadows at lower elevations. In winter, this window was covered with oiled cloth, and the workshop ran entirely on the light of butter lamps, 2 or 3 of them burning at all times, their flames moving slightly in the drafts that came through the walls, making the shadows on the ceiling shift and ripple like water. At the center of the workshop was the casting table, a thick slab of granite on which the molds were assembled before firing. Around it, on rough wooden shelves and stone ledges, were the tools of Zanabazar's primary art, small knives for the detailed work on wax models, brushes of different sizes, containers of white clay, bronze ingots in various weights, the ceramic crucibles that the molten metal was poured from when the moment of casting arrived. On one wall, pinned with wooden pegs, were sheets of paper bearing drawings, not finished designs but working drawings, question in line form, attempts to work out the problem of how a gesture of the hand or a fold of a robe would translate from 2 dimensions into 3. The technique Zanabazar used was called lost wax casting. It is a process of extraordinary patience, very old, used in civilizations across Asia for thousands of years, and entirely defined by a quality of not knowing that is built into its structure and cannot be removed. The sculptor begins with wax. He shapes the wax by hand, using heat and small tools, working the form in full detail, the tilt of a face, The precise angle at which the eyes look downward into the middle distance that is the characteristic gaze of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas in meditation. Every fold of the robe across the chest and the knees and the extended foot, the exact position of each finger around the gesture of the hand. This takes days or weeks. The wax model, when complete, is the fullest expression of the sculptor's intention, every detail resolved. Every relationship between one element and another balanced and refined to the limit of his skill and attention. Then the wax model is encased in clay. The clay must be applied carefully, in layers, allowed to dry between applications, building up to a thickness sufficient to survive the firing. Once the clay shell is complete, the entire assemblage clay encasing wax is placed in the kiln. The temperature rises. The clay hardens into something that will hold molten metal. The wax inside melts and drains away through small channels left open for that purpose, leaving behind it a perfect void, an absence in exactly the shape of everything the sculptor created. Then the crucible of molten bronze or gilded brass is brought from the furnace and poured into that void. The metal flows into the negative space where the wax was, filling every fold and gesture and curve of face. It cools. It contracts slightly as it cools. And then the sculptor waits for hours. Sometimes for an entire day for the metal to solidify completely before the clay shell can be broken. That breaking is the moment of discovery. There is no way to know, while the clay is intact, whether what is inside it succeeded or failed. There is no way to check. You cannot open a small hole and look. In the act of looking would compromise the integrity of the casting. You must wait, and then break the clay, and then see what the fire and the metal made of the form you created in wax. Sometimes the face that emerges is exactly what the sculptor intended, the serene expression, the gaze directed precisely at the angle that the iconographic tradition specifies, and that the sculptor's own sense of rightness confirmed during the weeks of working the wax model. Sometimes there are flaws, a bubble of air trapped in the mold that left a void in the metal, a surface imperfection where the clay and the brass did not separate cleanly, a subtle distortion in the expression that came from some variable in the cooling that could not have been anticipated. When the flaws are minor, they can sometimes be corrected with a graving tool after the casting is complete. When they are fundamental, when the face itself is wrong, the casting is set aside and the process begins again. A new wax model is started. Weeks of work, poured again into the beginning. A young man arrived at Tuvkan Monastery in the summer of 1683. His name was Badam Racha, and he had been sent from Erdain Zoo by his family to study with the master. He was 20 years old, talented enough with his hands that the monks at Erdain Zoo had recommended him, and deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty in almost any form. This was not a personal failing. It was simply the way his mind had been organized by his temperament and his upbringing. He was a person who liked to understand the outcome of a thing before he committed himself to it, who found it difficult to work without knowing whether the work would succeed, who had a tendency to plan and then replan rather than begin. He arrived to find Zanabazar at the casting table, finishing a wax model of a green Tara, one of the forms of the female bodhisattva of compassion, recognizable by her S-curved posture and the extended right foot that indicates she is stepping down from the lotus throne to come to the aid of any being who calls to her. The figure in wax was not yet complete. Zanabazar was working the face with a small blunt-tipped tool, his movements slow and certain in the way that long practice makes movement certain. Not hurried, but also not hesitant. The butter lamps on either side of the table made the wax surface glow amber, Outside, the larch forest on the lower slope was in its full summer green, visible through the high southern window. Badam Ragsha stood at the workshop entrance for a while without speaking. When Zanabazar eventually looked up, the young man introduced himself. The master nodded. He looked at his hands for a moment to assess where in the work he was, and then set the tool down and gestured at a low stool near the table. "Sit," he said. Badam Ragsha sat. He watched Zanabazar work for some time before he gathered the courage to ask what was already in his mind. "When you finish the wax model," he said, "how will you know if the casting will succeed?" Zanabazar did not answer immediately. He made 2 more small adjustments to the surface of the Tara's face, pressure applied and released, the wax responding to the warmth of his touch before he looked at the young man. "I will not know," he said. "Not until I break the clay." Badam Ragsha absorbed this. Does that not make it very difficult to work? Spending all this time on the model, not knowing whether the casting will preserve what you have made? The master was quiet again. He looked at the wax figure in front of him. The green Tara's face had the characteristic expression of a deity who is both still and in motion, present in complete peace, and also genuinely available. Not remote. Attending to the world from a place of unshakable composure. Getting this expression right in wax was a matter of fractions, tiny differences in the angle of an eyelid, the depth of a curve at the corner of a mouth, the relationship between the brow and the line of the nose that no measurement could fully specify, and that the sculptor had to find through the accumulated intelligence of his hands. "I spent many years," Zanabazar said finally, "unable to work well because I could not stop asking the same question you are asking. I wanted to know before I began whether what I was making would be right, whether the clay would hold, whether the metal would fill the mold cleanly, whether the expression I was after would survive the fire." He picked up the tool again and made 1 more adjustment to the surface. Then he set it down with a small, decisive movement. What I discovered slowly, and only through many broken castings, is that the work does not need my certainty. The wax only needs my attention. When I am working the form, and I am fully present to what the form requires in this moment, not thinking about what the casting might produce, not planning for the possibility of failure, not rehearsing what I will do if the face comes out wrong, that is when the form becomes true. When I step back and try to guarantee the outcome, the work stops moving. The hand becomes careful in the wrong way. The form begins to be shaped by fear rather than by understanding. Badam Ragsha was quiet for a long time. "But what do you do?" he said at last. "When the casting fails, when you break the clay and what is inside is not what you made." Zanabazar looked at him directly. "I look at what came out," he said. "I try to understand which variable in the process produced the flaw. Was the clay too thin in a particular area? Did the metal cool unevenly? Was there a bubble in the wax I did not see? Sometimes I understand what happened. Sometimes I do not. And then I begin again. I make another wax model. I encase it in clay. I pour again. That is all. The Tara exists in the tradition. She does not depend on this particular casting. My only responsibility is to bring my full attention to the shaping of what is in front of me now." Badam Ragsha stayed at Tuvakone for 3 years. During that time, he watched Zanabazar complete the green Tara that was on the casting table when he arrived. The clay was broken on a winter morning when the valley below was obscured by low cloud, and the face that emerged from the shattered clay carried exactly the expression that had been present in the wax. The gaze between stillness and approach, the composure that was not indifference. He watched other castings fail. He watched the master set the failed pieces aside and return, without apparent anguish, to the beginning of the process. He watched Zanabazar work through the late evenings by butter lamplight, the flames throwing moving shadows across the walls, the scratching of the tool against wax barely audible above the sound of the mountain wind. He watched the Soyombo script come into existence in the year 1686, an entirely new alphabet that Zanabazar invented in this same workshop, designed so that the sounds of Mongolian, Tibetan, and Sanskrit could all be transcribed in a single system. The script was not a revision or an adaptation. It was new. It required Zanabazar to work in a territory where he could not know in advance whether what he was creating would function, whether the symbols he was devising would be capable of carrying all three languages, whether the relationships between characters would be logically coherent, whether other people would be able to read it. He created it in the same way he created his sculptures, by attending fully to what the task required in each moment, and releasing the question of outcome to the process itself. The Soyombo script is today the national symbol of Mongolia. The first letter of the script appears on the Mongolian flag and on the national currency and on official documents across the country. Zanabazar could not have known this when he was working by butter lamp in the cold workshop above the Orian Valley. He could only know that the problem in front of him required his full attention, and give it. In 1688, the army of Galdan Boshuktu Khan swept east across the steppe and destroyed Tovkern Monastery. Everything in the workshop, the tools, the failed castings, the drawings pinned to the wall, the clay and the wax and the ingots of bronze was burned or scattered. Zanabazar fled south with 20,000 Khalkar refugees seeking the protection of the Qing emperor. He carried in his mind every transmission and teaching he had received. He carried very little else. In exile, he continued. He performed Buddhist ceremonies. He maintained his practice. He taught those who came to him. He returned to Mongolia at the age of 66 to supervise the restoration of Erdainzu Monastery. He continued to create until the end of his life. He died in Beijing in the year 1723, at the age of 88, having spent the final weeks of his life conducting funeral rites for an emperor he had traveled to honor. The green Tara that was completed on that winter morning in Tovkern is now in the Zanabazar Museum of Fine Arts in Ulaanbaatar. 340 years after the clay was broken, the face carries its expression still, the composure of someone who has learned to step forward into an uncertain world without requiring the world to first reveal its intentions. Let this teaching rest in you for a moment. Not as an instruction to do anything differently, simply as a recognition of something you may have already sensed, that the demand to know the outcome before beginning, before speaking, before loving, before committing your attention to what is present in front of you right now is not protection. It is the only thing standing between you and the work that is actually available to you in this moment. Your breath is moving. It does not know what the next breath will bring. It does not need to. It moves anyway, full attention to the present movement, and then release, and then whatever comes. This is what Zanabazar spent 30 years in the land of happy solitude learning. Not certainty, not control. The freedom of full attention given to what is actually here, and the willingness to release the rest. The wax does not need your certainty. It only needs your hands, present, attending, doing what the form requires right now. Let your jaw soften. Let the muscles around your eyes release. The outcome of tomorrow is not in your hands tonight. What is in your hands is only this breath, and now this one. That is enough. That has always been enough. And as we release the mountain and the monastery and the man who poured 30 years of careful attention into the small, cold workshop above the Orkhon Valley, we travel now to another kind of darkness. Further south, across a vast stretch of continent, to the forests of an ancient kingdom where a teacher once discovered that his most important lesson could only be given after every lamp had gone out. If sleep is coming, let it come. You do not need to hold on. The stories will find you in whatever state you arrive. In the late 13th century, or inside the walled city of Angkor Thom in the heart of the Khmer Empire, there were more than 70 wooden prayer halls built within the ancient stone foundations of older Hindu and Mahayana temples. The Chinese diplomat, Zhou Daguan, who lived in the Khmer capital for a year, beginning in 1296, wrote in his account of the kingdom that the Theravada monks he observed walked barefoot through the city streets each morning, carrying their alms bowls, their saffron robes draped with one shoulder bare despite the heat. He noted that they recited their prayers from books made of very evenly stacked palm leaves, sluk rith. The Khmer people called them leaf manuscripts whose lines were carved into the dried surface with iron styluses and rubbed with black pigment so that the letters stood raised and dark against the golden ground of the leaf. He wrote that these monks were simple in their requirements, humble in their bearing, and that there was a quality of directness about them that stood in marked contrast to the elaborate ceremonialism of the Hindu priests and the Mahayana scholars who had held the center of Khmer religious life for generations before them. The transition had not been sudden. For most of the Angkor period spanning 4 centuries, from roughly the 9th to the 13th, the dominant religion of the Khmer Empire had been a synthesis of Shaivite Hinduism and Mahayana Buddhism, both forms elevated and ceremonial, both requiring a learned priestly class trained in Sanskrit and elaborate ritual to stand between the teaching and the ordinary person. Theravada Buddhism was different in its fundamental orientation. It was a religion that could be explained in the Khmer vernacular. Its central practices sitting, attending to the breath, maintaining ethical precepts required no intermediary, no special caste of priests, no expensive ritual apparatus. The wandering Theravada missionaries who began entering Cambodia from the Mon kingdoms of Siam, from the Sinhalese monasteries of Sri Lanka, brought a form of the Dharma that could be taken directly into the hands of ordinary people and practiced by them without requiring the structures of the old religious system. It was a period of deep uncertainty for the kingdom. The empire that had built Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom, that had mobilized tens of thousands of workers to carve the most complex system of bas-reliefs in the ancient world, that had engineered a water management system across hundreds of square kilometers of forest and plain, was losing its grip. The borders were being pressed by the Siamese kingdom to the west. The elaborate hydraulic infrastructure that had supported the city's enormous population was beginning to fail. The certainty that had characterized Angkor at the height of its power, the certainty of divine kingship, of cosmic order expressed in stone, of permanence encoded in the very proportions of the temple towers, was dissolving. And into this dissolving certainty came a tradition that did not promise certainty as the reward for correct religious practice. It offered something different, a way of being with uncertainty that did not require uncertainty to first resolve. Imagine a wooden vihara built against the inner eastern wall of Angkor Thom. In the late rainy season of 1294, the monsoon had ended 6 weeks before, but the wet season smell remained in everything in the dark earth of the compound, in the wood of the hall's old beams, in the thick vegetation that had grown against the outer wall during the months of rain. The hall was built of recycled timber, beams salvaged from structures of an earlier era whose purposes were no longer clear, and in the grain of some of these beams you could see the particular darkening that comes from age, a density that fresh wood never has, as though the wood had been slowly compressed by time into something harder and more final than the tree it came from. The floor was packed clay, polished by decades of bare feet to a smoothness that felt almost cool even in the afternoon heat. Along both walls, narrow, shuttered windows let in the morning light, a thick, greenish, moving light filtered through the aerial roots of banyan trees that had seeded themselves against the stone outer wall sometime in the previous century and grown into large, complex things, their curtains of hanging roots swaying slightly when the wind moved through the compound. At one end of the hall, on a low-carved platform, sat a small bronze image of the seated Buddha, not a Khmer image, but one that had come from Sri Lanka with the first wave of ordained monks. Its proportions different from the Khmer aesthetic, its expression simpler and more inward. Before it, a small lamp burned through the teaching hours, its flame very still in the enclosed air of the hall. On a shelf to the left of the image, a set of palm leaf manuscripts rested in their lacquered wooden case, decorated with a pattern of lotus flowers painted in dark red pigment that had faded over the years to a deep brown. In the mornings, 2 monks taught and practiced in this vihara. The elder was Samnang, who had been among the first generation of Khmer monks to be ordained in the Sinhalese Mahavihara lineage, the tradition brought back to Cambodia by Tamalinda, who had travelled to Sri Lanka in the year 1180 and returned a decade later with the Pali Canon and the authority to ordain. Samnang had studied in Sri Lanka for 8 years, returning in his late 30s with a command of Pali that was unusual among his contemporaries, with a precise understanding of the Vinaya, the monastic code, and with a quality of personal stillness that he never spoke about directly, but that was immediately legible to anyone who spent time in his presence. He was a small man, his scalp shaved and his skin deepened by decades of walking barefoot through city streets under the tropical sun. His robe was old and carefully mended. The saffron faded to a color closer to ochre. He did not explain when he could demonstrate. He did not speak when silence would serve. He had a quality not patience in any strained sense, more like the settled certainty of something that has already happened and is simply waiting for events to arrive where it is, of knowing where his students would eventually find their way without needing to force their arrival. The younger monk was a novice named Sotha. He was 22 years old, 3 years into his novitiate, the son of a family of merchants who had been among the first generation of lay Cambodians to take refuge in the Theravada Sangha after the Sinhalese ordination was established in the capital. He had entered the monastery from a genuine interior drawing toward the practice, one he had been unable to explain when his father asked him why. He only knew that sitting in the company of the monks during the public recitations had produced in him a quality of stillness that nothing else in his experience had produced, and that he wanted to understand how to access that stillness in any circumstance. Not only when the monks were chanting and the incense was burning and the quality of the light through the hall windows was exactly right. He was, by all observable measures, a serious and committed practitioner. He rose earlier than his fellow novices. His prostrations were careful and unhurried. The Pali recitations came to him readily. He had the kind of memory that absorbed structured material easily. And within 18 months of entering the vihara, he could recite the entire morning and evening chanting sequences from memory without consulting the palm leaf texts. His teacher had praised this specifically, noting that correct recitation required correct breathing and that Sothar's breath control during recitation was among the best he had observed in a student of his level. And yet Sothar was, underneath all of this, carrying something that his careful externals did not reveal, a persistent, specific, exhausting uncertainty about whether any of what he was doing was real. He could not locate his concern in any particular failure. It was not that he was violating precepts or neglecting his duties or lying to his teacher about the quality of his practice. It was something more subtle and therefore harder to address. When he sat in formal meditation, the breath as object, the attention steady on the sensation of air moving through the nostrils, he could produce a surface that appeared, from the outside, to be a composed and settled mind. His teacher would observe the sitting sessions and give no indication that anything was wrong. But inside the session, Sothar kept finding himself split. One part was ostensibly sitting with the breath, and another part was standing slightly apart from that sitting, observing it, assessing it, asking whether the sitting was correct, whether the quality of attention was the quality that was supposed to be there, whether the absence of dramatic experience meant that nothing was happening, or whether dramatic experience was itself a distraction that a more advanced practitioner would not be having. The split observer was tireless. It asked its questions in every session, regardless of how much time had passed or how correct his external practice had become. He brought this to Samnang one evening, when the other novices had gone to their cells. The hall was quiet. The lamp burned with its small flame. Outside, the banyan roots stirred against the closed shutters, a soft, patient sound, like something that has been waiting a long time and has stopped being impatient about it. "Teacher," he said, "how does a practitioner know whether they are actually practicing or only performing the appearance of practice?" Samnang did not respond immediately. He was sitting with his hands resting on his knees in the particular way that was simply how he sat, not a formal meditation posture, but not careless either. The posture of a person whose body has learned over decades to hold itself without effort in a state of available attention. "Tell me more carefully what you mean," he said. Sothar had been thinking about how to articulate this for weeks. "I mean, when I sit, there is the sitting, and then there is also the watching of the sitting. The part that checks whether the attention is where it should be, whether the quality of the session is the quality it should be, whether I am making the progress I should be making, and that watching it never stops. And I cannot tell whether the watching is itself a form of practice or whether it is the thing that prevents practice from happening." Samnang was quiet for a moment. The lamp flame barely moved. From somewhere beyond the eastern wall, very faint, came the sound of the city settling into its evening, the low murmur of a family's conversation, the sharp call of a bird, the distant bell of another hall marking the hour. "Close your eyes," Samnang said. Sothar closed them. "Describe what is in this room." Sothar began to speak. The bronze image on the platform at the far end, the lacquered manuscript case on its shelf, the mat beneath him, woven in a pattern of dark and pale threads. The lamp, he could sense its warmth, even with his eyes closed, could smell the butter oil it burned. The two shuttered windows, their wooden frames slightly uneven from years of seasonal expansion and contraction. "Now," said Samnang, "I am going to extinguish the lamp." The small sound of a breath being exhaled close to the flame. And then the darkness came. It was not the ordinary darkness of a room with the lamp turned low. It was the complete dark of a closed interior at night, the dark that presses on the closed eyelids and produces no difference when the eyes open. The familiar room, which Sothar had moved through hundreds of times, became something else. Not dangerous, but unknowable in the way that maps become unknowable when you step off them. The image of the room that he carried in his mind, the precise location of each object, the distance from his mat to the manuscript case, the height of the offering shelf was still there, accurate, intact. It was simply useless. It was information about a place he could not currently navigate by means of that information. Now, Samnang said. His voice in the darkness was different, no louder, but somehow less mediated, arriving more directly, the way sound always travels differently when sight is removed. Tell me what is in this room. Sothar was quiet. You carry a complete and accurate picture of this room in your mind. Samnang continued. Every object, every distance, every proportion. That picture is entirely correct. It is not wrong. But tell me, is it helping you navigate the room right now? The question did not seem to need an answer. Place your hand on the floor in front of you, Samnang said. Sothar lowered his right hand to the mat. He felt the individual threads of the weave, the slight unevenness where one section was more tightly wound than another, the coolness of the packed clay through the thin fabric beneath. What do you feel? The mat, the texture of the weave. The floor is cool beneath it. Is the floor uncertain? A pause. No. Is the texture certain? Yes. Then there is something in this room that is completely available to you, Samnang said, even in total darkness. Even when the image of the room has become useless as a guide. The contact of your hand with the mat is not uncertain. It is not approximate. It is more present to you right now than all your accurate knowledge of where every object in this room is located. He allowed the silence to hold what he had said. The insects in the banyan trees outside resumed the sustained, high sound that had paused when he spoke. The smell of the burned lamp oil was present in the air, a familiar smell, no longer attached to visible light. Just a smell. This is what you are doing when you meditate, Samnang said. You are consulting the picture of the room instead of placing your hand on the mat. You carry in your mind an image of what correct practice looks and feels like, what the quality of attention is supposed to be, what the breath is supposed to feel like when you are truly with it rather than performing it. And in each session, you consult that image, checking whether what is actually happening matches what is supposed to happen. The image is not wrong. Your understanding of what right practice is probably reasonably accurate. But the image is not the room. And as long as you are consulting the image, your hand is not on the mat. He relit the lamp. The flame found its steadiness after a moment of searching, and the room returned the same room. Objects in the same locations. The image confirmed, and the darkness replaced. Samnang's face in the lamp's light was the face of a person who had said something completely practical, the way a craftsman says something practical when he corrects the angle of a student's tool. The quality called sati, Samnang said, settling back into his sitting posture, is not a quality of particularly good attention. It is only the quality of attention that is actually present rather than absent. When your hand is on the mat, and you know your hand is on the mat, that is sati, not the feeling of the mat. The knowing of the feeling, the two things occurring together, without the gap of the observer between them. That is sufficient. That is the whole practice. not the achievement of a particular state of luminous awareness. Only this, contact, and the knowing of contact, occurring at the same time, in the same place. Sothar sat quietly in the returning lamplight. "And when it is lost," he said, "when the hand lifts from the mat without my noticing, when I am back in the image instead of the room, you return." Samnang said, "There is no failure in this. The lamp does not become a lesser lamp because it was extinguished and relit. The room does not become a different room. You place your hand on the mat again. You feel what is there. You know what you feel. That is the whole of the returning, and it has the same value in the 10,000th moment of a session as it had in the first." In the weeks that followed, Sothar's practice changed in a way he could not have described to anyone who had not sat in that dark room. It was not that the quality of his attention became dramatically better. It was that the split closed, the observer stepped down from its watching post. Not because he had silenced it or egued it into submission. Because he had understood, through the darkness and the hand on the mat, that the observer's question, "Am I doing this correctly?" was unanswerable from the outside, and that the attempt to answer it from the outside was itself the thing that was preventing him from being inside the practice. When the attention wandered, it wandered. When he noticed that it had wandered, he returned. The noticing and the returning were themselves the practice, not evidence of failure, not signs that something more stable was still missing. Just the ordinary movement of a lamp being extinguished and relit. The room unchanged, the mat still there, the floor still cool beneath it. This matters for tonight. Because the mind that cannot rest is often doing exactly what Sothar was doing in the dark room before Samnang extinguished the lamp, consulting the image of rest instead of placing its hand on the mat. Checking whether the relaxation is the correct depth of relaxation. Assessing whether the breath is the breath of a person about to sleep or the breath of a person trying to sleep and therefore not sleeping. Comparing the current quality of lying here to the image of what successful lying here would feel like, and finding the comparison wanting, and redoubling the effort that is itself the obstacle. The teaching from the extinguished lamp is simpler than any instruction about how to relax. It is only this: place your hand on the mat. Find what is not uncertain. The weight of the body against the surface that holds it not uncertain. The air moving through the nose, slightly cooler entering, slightly warmer leaving not uncertain. The pressure of the blanket or the sheet against the feet. The chest, wherever you feel it most clearly right now, not uncertain. These things are completely available in this darkness. They do not require you to navigate by the image of the room. They do not require certainty about whether you are doing this correctly. They only require the contact. The simple, available, ordinary contact of attention with what is actually here. The breath is moving, not because you have achieved the correct quality of presence, because breathing is what bodies do, with or without your monitoring, with or without your certainty. Through every state of wakefulness and sleep and the uncertain territory between them. The breath has been moving through every night of your life without your certainty about whether it was moving correctly. It does not need that certainty now. Let your jaw soften. Let the muscles around your eyes release. Let your hands open against whatever surface they are resting on, not arranging them. Simply allowing them to be where they already are. The mat is there. The floor is beneath the mat. They are not going anywhere. Place your attention there and let it rest, not checking whether it is resting correctly. Simply resting, And as the dark room of this night becomes less a place of navigation and more a place of simply being, as the observer quietly steps down, we travel now toward yet another kind of not knowing. To the island of Sri Lanka in an ancient time, where a man named Mahinda walked down from a mountain carrying teachings that had just arrived in a kingdom that did not yet know what it was waiting to receive. If sleep is reaching for you, let it have you. The stories will find you wherever you are. Before the mountain was called Mihintale, before it had any name beyond the Sinhalese words for dense forest and wild hill, it was a royal hunting ground. The Mahavamsa, the great chronicle of Sri Lanka, written in the 5th century of the Common Era, but drawing on oral traditions and inscriptions of far greater antiquity, records that the mountain rose from the dry zone plain in 4 peaks, reaching just over 1,000 feet above sea level. Its slopes covered in jungle teeming with deer and wild fowl, and that the kings of Anuradhapura would come to its lower reaches in the early morning hours, when the mist was still thick over the northern plain and the air under the canopy carried that particular quality of cool that tropical forests hold through the night and surrender only slowly to the rising heat of the day. 8 miles east of the ancient capital, the terrain around the mountain's base was a landscape of grey-green light and deep shade, the light filtering down through a canopy of ironwood and tamarind, and the large-leafed trees whose names do not survive in the chronicle, but whose presence is implicit in everything. The chronicle describes the movement of animals through undergrowth, the sudden clearing where visibility opens, the different quality of sound that distinguishes a space enclosed by close vegetation from a space that lets sound travel. The granite outcroppings that crowned the mountain's upper peaks caught the sun differently from the surrounding jungle. And in the dry season, months when the haze lifted off the plain, those upper rocks glinted at certain times of day in a way that could be seen from Anuradhapura itself, a brief, distant brightness, like something reflecting that it had received. It was in the 3rd century before the Common Era that a man named Mahinda came to stand on those upper rocks. Mahinda was the firstborn son of the Emperor Ashoka of the Maurya dynasty, born to Ashoka's first wife Devi in the years before the Kalinga War, before the conquest that killed 100,000 people and transformed the emperor from one of the most effective military rulers in ancient Indian history into the most famous Buddhist patron the ancient world produced. The son born before that transformation grew up in proximity to power without being entirely of it. He had the education of a prince and the mind of a scholar, and he had watched, through the years of his youth, the way power operates on those who hold it, the way certainty calculates, the way authority is maintained by the appearance of knowing what will happen, the way the apparatus of empire requires and produces a particular quality of confidence that cannot afford to be seen doubting. When, at the age of 20, he chose ordination as a Buddhist monk over the inheritance of that apparatus, the choice resolved a political situation that would otherwise have been dangerous, a prince who would not inherit and could not safely be left near those who would. But it produced something that no political resolution could have manufactured: genuine freedom from the claims that certainty makes on a person who has something to lose. The monk who carries nothing has nothing to protect. The monk who has relinquished the need for outcomes to confirm his worth has nothing to manage. What remains, when all of that has been set down, is a clarity of attention that can be brought entirely to bear on what is actually present. He had studied at the great monastery at Sanchi in central India, years of sitting, walking, studying the texts and the Vinaya and the precise formulations through which the tradition preserved what it understood about the nature of mind and liberation. He had been recognized as having attained arhatship, the completion of the path in the Theravada understanding, the state in which the roots of craving and ignorance have been fully uprooted and the mind is no longer driven by the forces that drive ordinary mental life. Arhatship does not produce certainty about external events. It produces something more useful, the capacity to be fully present to whatever arises, without being distorted by fear of a particular outcome. He had been part of the great council convened by Ashoka in Pataliputra, at which disputes over doctrinal matters were adjudicated. Corrupt monks were expelled from the Sangha, and a decision was made to send missionary parties to 9 different regions beyond the borders of the empire to carry the Dharma outward from its Indian center into the world. Mahinda was selected to lead the mission to the island of Lanka, the island that would one day be called Sri Lanka, which lay across the Palk Strait to the south and east. Known to Indian traders and to the Mauryan court as a prosperous kingdom under the rule of a king who had exchanged gifts with Ashoka and was considered an ally. Though the two men had never met, he prepared. He had learned the language of Lanka, the Sinhalese tongue. Different enough from the Sanskrit and Pali, he already knew that it required specific and deliberate study. He carried in his memory the complete oral tradition of the Pali canon as it had been established and confirmed at the Pataliputra Council, the teachings of the Buddha in the form in which they had been preserved, verified, and cross-referenced by the assembled senior monks. The most thorough attempt that had yet been made to ensure that what would be transmitted to future generations was what had actually been said. He carried the Vinaya, the monastic code, with its precise rules for the establishing of a proper Sangha. He carried, in his person and the persons of his 5 companions, the ordination lineage that would allow a new monastic community to be established in Lanka with full canonical validity. He had, in other words, prepared as thoroughly as any person could prepare for a mission of this kind. And that preparation, complete as it was, could not answer the question that he carried alongside everything else across the Palk Strait, whether any of it would work. The Mahavamsa records that Mahinda and his companions arrived on the summit of Misaka Mountain on the full moon day of the month of Poson, the lunar month that corresponds to May or June, the beginning of the southwest monsoon season, when the island's vegetation was at its most dense and vivid, and the heavy air carried the particular combination of heat and moisture that preceded the rains. The chronicle describes the arrival in language of miraculous flight, the monks rising from Sanchi and alighting on the summit of Misaka as though the sea between were nothing. Whether this preserves an actual memory of supernatural travel, or whether it encodes in heightened language the experience of a crossing that felt, to those who made it, impossible to explain in ordinary terms, what is preserved with clarity is the fact of the arrival and the quality of what happened immediately after. King Devanampiya Tissa, whose name translates roughly as beloved of the gods, was on the mountain that morning because he came there to hunt. The Mahavamsa records that he had with him a large retinue, and that he was pursuing a stag through the dense undergrowth of the upper slopes when the animal fled into a clearing, and he followed it and found himself standing at the edge of that clearing, facing 6 shaven-headed men in saffron robes standing quietly among the trees in the early morning light. He stopped. The stag moved away behind him, forgotten. The retinue came to a halt somewhere in the undergrowth behind the king. The Mahavamsa says that he was frightened, that the appearance of monks in a place where no monks had any reason to be produced in him, the particular form of fear that comes from encountering something entirely outside the known map of the world, something that does not belong to any category of the familiar and therefore cannot be safely assessed. He thought, the chronicle says, that he was looking at yakas, demons, things that wore human form but were not human. He stood still, He did not run. He stood at the edge of the clearing in the early morning light, with his heart doing what hearts do when the world suddenly contains something it should not contain, and he waited for whatever would happen next. What happened next was that Mahinda spoke to him. In Sinhalese, his Sinhalese, imperfect perhaps, at the edges, carrying the accent of someone who learned the language from teachers rather than from childhood, Mahinda said, "We are monks. Great King. We are followers of the Gautama Buddha. We have come from India out of compassion for you." There was a long moment in the clearing. The mist was still moving off the lower slopes below them. The trees were full of early morning birds, whose names neither man in that clearing could have given to the other. The king looked at the monks, and the monks with the particular quality of stillness that comes from years of meditation practice, from the habit of the body simply being where it is without requiring the situation to be different, looked back. Then Mahinda asked the king about a mango tree. He asked, "Do you see this mango tree? Are there other mango trees on this mountain? Among those other mango trees, is there anyone that is the same tree as this one? And among all the trees on this mountain, are there any trees that are neither mango trees nor this particular mango tree?" The king answered each question. He answered them with a precision and a mobility of mind moving easily between particular and general, between this tree and the category of mango tree, between the category of mango tree and the broader category of all trees that told Mahinda what he needed to know. He told him not simply because the answers were correct. He told him because the questions themselves had been the moment of testing, the moment when Mahinda, standing in a clearing on a mountain in a foreign country, carrying everything he had brought across the sea and not yet knowing whether any of it would find a place to land, had asked the ground beneath him, "Are you sufficient?" And the ground had answered, through the king's precise and unhurried responses, "Yes." Then Mahinda taught. He taught the Chulahathi Padapama Sutta, the discourse on the simile of the elephant's footprint, standing on a granite outcropping above the jungle canopy of Misaka Mountain, with the northern plain of Lanka spread out below him in the morning light. The Mahavamsa records that the king and many of those with him attained the first stage of the path, became stream enterers, people in whom something has shifted permanently, who have glimpsed the nature of reality clearly enough that the direction of their lives has been irrevocably changed. But the story that is worth carrying into this night is not the story of that moment of transmission. It is the story of the moment before the moment when Mahinda stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at a frightened king and did not yet know. He did not know if the language he had learned was sufficient. He did not know if the king's mind was capable of receiving what he had brought. He did not know if this island, this morning, this mountain, was the right place for what he carried. He had made the crossing. He had climbed the mountain. He had arrived. And standing in the clearing with no script for what came next, with a frightened king and a disappeared deer and the entire Pali canon in his memory, and no certainty whatsoever about what the ground could hold, he asked about a mango tree. This is what trust looks like when it is not yet a feeling, when the certainty has not arrived, when the preparation is complete and the destination is reached and the outcome is entirely unknown. You ask about a mango tree. You listen to the answer. You discover what the ground can hold by setting something down on it and staying attentive to whether it holds. And then, because the ground is sufficient, because it almost always is, you teach. The Mahavamsa records that Mahinda lived for the rest of his long life on that mountain. He was given 68 caves on the slopes of Misaka and taught from them for nearly half a century. He never returned to India. He died on that mountain at the age of 80. The mountain that had been a hunting ground became a monastery. And the monastery grew for 1,000 years at one point, housing over 2,000 monks, until the decline of the Anuradhapura kingdom reduced it to the ruins that have been visible on the slopes ever since. And today, the mountain still carries his name in a form that has survived 2.5 millennia of the particular uncertainties of human history. Mihintale, the plateau of Mihindu, named for the monk who stood in a clearing and asked about a mango tree because it was the only question available that would tell him what the ground could hold. What the mountain carries is not the story of a man who was certain. It is the story of a man who was prepared as thoroughly as any person can be prepared, and who discovered, in the clearing, that preparation and certainty are entirely different things. Preparation fills you with what you might need. Certainty would tell you in advance which of those things will actually be required and how the ground will receive them and what the outcome will be. Certainty is not available in any clearing worth entering. Preparation is. And preparation, offered fully and without reservation into the not knowing of the moment that is actually here, is sufficient. This is the third teaching woven through the tradition of not knowing, and it connects the two that came before. The woman in the Tibetan cave discovered that not knowing could be stayed in that remaining inside uncertainty without demanding it resolve was itself the deepest form of the practice. The sculptor on the Mongolian mountain discovered that not knowing could be worked inside that full attention given to the present task is sufficient, regardless of whether the outcome can be seen in advance. Here on the Sri Lankan mountain, the monk who had crossed the sea discovered a third movement, that not knowing can be walked into. That the clearing does not have to be already familiar before you speak into it. That the ground does not have to be confirmed safe before you put your weight on it. That the act of stepping forward attentive, prepared, willing, is itself what makes the ground reveal whether it is sufficient. This distinction matters because the mind's strategy for managing uncertainty is usually one of waiting. Waiting until more information arrives. Waiting until the anxiety settles and the certainty comes and the feeling of readiness appears. And sometimes waiting is wise. But the feeling of readiness does not always arrive before the moment that requires it. Sometimes the moment arrives first. Sometimes you are standing in the clearing, and all you have is the preparation you made and the willingness to speak and the question that will tell you, if you listen carefully to the answer, whether the ground is there. You have made crossings like this one, not across straits of water, perhaps, but across the straits of silence before a difficult conversation. Across the distance between what you feel and what you are willing to say. Every time you have offered something genuine to another person, a truth, an apology, a love that might not be returned, you have stood in Mahinda's clearing. You have carried something across uncertain water and set it down in a place whose readiness you could not know in advance. And the ground, almost always, has held. Tonight, the crossing is smaller. It is only the crossing from wakefulness into sleep. And even this one cannot be made by certainty. It can only be made by willingness, by the decision to lie down in the clearing and allow the ground to do what the ground does, by letting the breath carry you the way the sea may have carried Mahinda, not because the destination is known, but because the crossing is available and the willingness is here. The anxiety that sits with you tonight, the unresolved thing the mind returns to, in the quiet, it is real. It deserves acknowledgement, but it does not need to be resolved before you can rest. Mahinda did not know the outcome before he made the crossing. He knew only what he was carrying and why it mattered. And he went, and the ground held. What you are carrying tonight is worth carrying. The person you are bringing into tomorrow's clearing is someone who has crossed difficult straits before and arrived. The ground is sufficient tonight. Not perfect. Not certain. Simply sufficient, capable of holding what you have brought. Capable of bearing your weight through the remaining hours of this night. Capable of carrying you forward into whatever morning comes next. The ground does not require your certainty. It only requires that you lie down on it. Just this breath completing itself. Let the weight of the day release downward through your body into whatever surface you are resting on. Let the arms and hands open slightly, unclenching whatever they have been holding. The surface is sufficient. The breath is moving in and out, carrying you through the not knowing of this night, the way Mahinda's companions carried the Dharma across the water, not knowing where it would land. Simply carrying it forward with full attention and the willingness to set it down. The night is here and you are in it. The ground is holding what you have brought. Everything that needed to arrive in this clearing has arrived. Just this breath. Just this moment in the clearing where nothing needs to be resolved in advance. And as we release the mountain of Mihintale, as that first morning above the plain dissolves back into the mist it came from, we move now toward a different kind of not knowing. Northward from Sri Lanka, across the sea and through centuries, to the mountain of Yen Tu in northern Vietnam, and to a king who gave everything away one autumn morning in the year 1299. And walked alone into a forest with nothing left to protect. If sleep is reaching for you, let it come. You do not need to stay awake. The stories will find you wherever you are. The records of the Trần dynasty preserve a detail that most histories pass over quickly. When Trần Nhân Tông left Thiên Trung Palace in the 10th month of 1299 to become a monk on Yen Tu Mountain, he left at midnight. Not at dawn, when departures carry the dignity of ceremony and witness. Not in the afternoon, with courtiers assembled to mark the transition. At midnight, the hour when no retinue would be assembled, when the palace would be at its deepest quiet, when a man could walk out of the life that had been built around him without being required to perform the leaving for an audience. The historical record is precise about this. He threw away his dragon robe. He shaved his head on the mountain. He took the Dharma name Huang Phan Dai Do Da, the great ascetic monk of the fragrant cloud, and he vowed to practice the 12 Dhutanga, the most demanding ascetic disciplines in the Theravada tradition. He was 40 years old. He had been king at 21. Between those ages, he had commanded the successful defense of his kingdom against the most powerful military empire in the history of the world, and then ruled a country at peace for 10 more years. And then abdicated and waited 6 years more before he allowed himself to make this walk. The midnight departure was the first time in his adult life that he had made a significant movement without a retinue, without witnesses, without advisors, without the apparatus of a state that had organized itself around his presence for 2 decades. He walked to Yen Tu. The mountain rises over 1,000 meters above sea level. Its highest peak, called Angkor Thom, the reclining cloud, in what is now Quang Ninh province in northern Vietnam, roughly 50 kilometers inland from the coast. The lower slopes of Yen Tu carry dense bamboo forest, Truc Lam, the bamboo grove, from which the tradition he would found takes its name. The bamboo there grows in the particular way of mountain bamboo, the culms taller and thinner than the lowland varieties, the leaves turning in the wind with a sound different from anything in the valleys below. a dry whispering that comes and goes with the air currents off the upper slopes and carries no particular urgency in any direction. Above the bamboo line, the mountain's middle slopes hold older trees, ancient conifers, hard-leafed evergreens whose roots grip the rock faces, their canopies appearing and disappearing in the months of autumn mist as cloud moves through them. The upper reaches, where the hermitages had been built above the 10th pagoda's elevation, were often entirely obscured for days at a time in the cold months, invisible from the valleys, existing in a quality of isolation that was both physical and atmospheric. He had been here before. As a teenager, as a young prince not yet crowned, he had tried to escape the palace and reach this mountain, had walked alone until the guards found him and brought him back. The mountain was not unknown to him, but arriving at 40, with a monk's robe and a shaved head and a new name, arriving as the person he had spent his entire life trying to become, this was a different kind of arrival from any he had made before. Tren Nhan Tong had been placed on the throne at 21 years old, following his father Trun Than Tong, and found himself king of a country already under existential pressure from the north. The Mongol Empire of Kublai Khan, the force that had conquered China, Korea, Persia, and the great Central Asian steppes, the most powerful military apparatus the world had yet assembled, had turned its attention to the small kingdom of Dai Viet to the south. Twice, the armies of the Yuan dynasty came. In 1285, invasion from the north. Nhan Tong was 27 years old. He held counsel in a manner the Vietnamese historical records call remarkable for its calm, consulting generals. Consulting his father, the Emperor Emeritus, choosing to yield the capital temporarily and draw the invasion into terrain unsuited to Mongol cavalry. The strategy held. The Mongols withdrew. In 1288, they came again, the third Mongol invasion of Dai Viet. And this time, the decisive engagement was naval at the Bach Dang River, where iron-tipped stakes planted in the riverbed destroyed the Mongol fleet at low tide, ending the campaign and ending, permanently, the Mongol pressure on the kingdom. He had commanded armies. He had made decisions that determined whether a kingdom of millions survived or was absorbed into an empire. He had held the certainty that kings are required to hold the performance of certainty at minimum, because armies do not fight with confidence under a king who visibly doubts, and had held it for 14 years, and then had abdicated the throne to his son, Trun Nhan Tong, and spent 6 more years as Emperor Emeritus, still present, still the largest figure in the political landscape. And then the midnight walk, the dragon robe on the palace floor, the shaved head, the mountain. The first night on Yen Tu was cold. October in the northern Vietnamese highlands carries a quality of cold that is different from the lowland autumn, a cold born from altitude and moisture, from the cloud layer that sits on the mountain's middle slopes and keeps the air damp even when rain is not falling. The hermitage Nut Duc, which he had ordered built in July of that year in preparation for this arrival, was simple. Wooden walls, a packed earth floor, a roof of thatch and clay tile. No bradju, no servants to maintain one, no retinue to consult about whether additional covering was needed, because there was no additional covering and there was no retinue. He sat in the hermitage and listened to the forest. The mind of a man who has commanded armies does not become still simply because the armies are gone. It continues doing what it has been trained to do across 2 decades of exercise. It assesses. It calculates. It formulates responses to situations that have not yet arisen and may not arise. The Vietnamese word tam carries in a single syllable what English requires 2 words to approximate heart-mind, the organ of both thinking and feeling, the center from which all action and all suffering and all potential liberation arise. His Tham did not know how to be on a mountain at midnight without a problem before it. It had spent 40 years being presented with problems. It had solved most of them. It had no experience of being asked to simply be present to the sound of bamboo moving in a mountain wind with nothing required in response. He could not sleep, not primarily from physical discomfort, though the body on packed earth is different from the body on a palace sleeping platform after 40 years of one and 1 night of the other. He could not sleep because the Tham would not allow it. Every time he approached the edge of sleep, that particular loosening of the body's maintained tension, that beginning of the breath's natural deepening and slowing, the mind reasserted its governance, pulled him back, presented a new item for consideration. This decision from 12 years ago, that conversation with a minister, this military choice, that arrangement of marriage and alliance, all of it already completed, all of it already settled by time, all of it utterly beyond revision or adjustment, and the mind reviewing it nonetheless, with the same energy it had brought to these matters when they were still open, when decisions still mattered, when a different choice was still possible. He had given away an empire in the act of abdicating. He had given away the authority and the certainty and the apparatus. And he had discovered on this first night, on Yen Tur, what becomes visible when everything external has been relinquished, that the mind continues its rule regardless, that the Tham which has spent a lifetime governing does not simply cease to govern when the kingdom is handed to someone else. It relocates its kingdom to the interior and continues there, with the same habits and the same insistence and the same inability to leave anything alone. On the second night, he walked out of the hermitage before sitting inside it. He walked the path above the 10th pagoda in the dark, knowing the path from his previous visits, knowing roughly where the larger routes crossed it, moving slowly in the cloud-dark night. The bamboo was quieter on the second night, the wind less. The cold was more expected and therefore less demanding of the mind's attention. He sat on a stone above the path and felt the mountain beneath him, the particular quality of a large stone that has been in the same place for 1,000 years. Its coldness, not the coldness of air, but the sustained coldness of deep rock. The cold of something that has never been warm in any human lifetime and does not require warmth to be entirely itself. He sat on that stone, and the Tham continued its business. The retrospective empire, the reviewed decisions, the imagined alternate histories. He noticed all of this. He had been taught by his teacher, Tue Trung Thuong Si, that noticing is itself the practice, that the quality of awareness which can observe the mind's activity without being swept into it is always already present, always already available, never actually absent, even when it seems most obscured. What Tue Trung had called the original face, the awareness prior to the mind's performance, was not something to be achieved, but something to be recognized. Already here, already looking. He walked out before dawn on the third night and stood lower on the slope. In the bamboo, the wind had dropped entirely. The cloud had settled. The darkness was absolute in the way that overcast altitude, darkness is absolute, no stars, no horizon, no orientation by light of any kind. He stood in it. Then he heard the stream, somewhere below him, perhaps 20 or 30 steps down the slope. A small mountain stream moved through stone. He had not heard it on the previous nights because the wind had covered it. He heard it now clearly, the small, continuous, irregular sound of cold water finding its way through rock. Not the sound of a significant river. Not the sound of water that calls for any response or decision or even any particular attention. Just water, moving, as it had been moving on this mountain since before any human being had come here, as it would continue moving after the last human being left. He stood and listened to it for a very long time. The Thom did not know how to argue with that sound. The sound was not asking anything of it. It was not a problem. It was not a decision. It was not a variable in any calculation. It was simply the sound of water moving through rock in the darkness before dawn on Yentu Mountain, which was exactly what it was, and exactly where it was, and in no respect different from what it had been for the entirety of the mountain's history. He stayed with the stream and listened until the first grey light came into the cloud above the eastern peaks. And when he went back inside and sat down, the Thom was not silent. It would not be silent for many more nights. But something had shifted in his relationship to its governance. The mind was still there, still reviewing, still performing its habitual governance of a kingdom that no longer existed. And he was also here, present to the stream, present to the cold, present to the quality of this particular darkness. The listening was not the mind. The listening was what remained when the mind ran out of an audience that required it to continue performing. The Truk Lam, teaching that he would spend the next 9 years developing and transmitting, preserves this understanding in a phrase, Doi Kan Vo Tam, encountering what arises with no discriminating mind. This does not mean the absence of awareness. It means the presence of an awareness prior to the mind's division of everything it encounters into categories of useful and useless, threatening and safe, resolved and unresolved. The sound of water is water moving. The cold of the mountain is cold. The darkness before dawn is darkness before dawn. None of it requires you to decide anything about it. You can simply be with it. And in that being with, in that quality of presence that does not add anything to what is simply here, the demand that you control everything in the range of your awareness simply has nowhere to land. He had been a good king partly because he understood the actual limits of his power, knew what could be governed and what could not, and spent his energy on the former rather than exhausting himself fighting the latter. But the Thom, left to its habits, does not accept limits. It extends its governance into the past, which is finished, and the future, which has not arrived. It tries to govern the sound of water in the dark, which does not need governing. It tries to govern the breath, which is already moving on its own. It tries to govern sleep, which comes when it comes and cannot be summoned by the same exertion of will that commands armies. The first teaching of Yentu is not about achieving peace through the suppression of the mind's activity. It is about discovering that the peace was already present before the mind began its performance, that the stream was already moving before he heard it, that the quality of awareness which could listen to it was already present before he chose to stand and listen. He did not create these things. He only stopped for long enough. Adding to them, the second teaching of Yentu is related, and it is perhaps more useful for a night like this one. It is not only that peace is already present, it is that letting go is not a loss. Every tradition that uses the phrase speaks of it as though something is surrendered and something is, in the most literal sense. He surrendered a kingdom. He surrendered the title, the ceremony, the authority, the retinue. He surrendered, on that midnight walk, everything that the external world had decided he was. And what he found waiting for him on the other side of that surrender was not diminishment. It was the stream. It was the cold stone. It was the quality of listening that had always been present but had never had the quiet required to make itself known. This is the shape of letting go that the Truk Lam tradition teaches, not the resignation of someone who has given up, but the relief of someone who has discovered that what they were gripping was not what they actually needed to hold. The Tam grips because it believes that gripping is protection, that if it relaxes its governance of the past will somehow become different, more damaging, more difficult to bear. That if it releases its rehearsal of the future will arrive unprepared for. That if it stops reviewing every decision, some crucial error will go uncorrected. None of this is true. The past is finished, whether or not the Tam reviews it. The future will arrive whether or not it has been rehearsed. And the stream on Yentu Mountain was moving long before any decision of any king had any bearing on anything. And it continued moving after everything he decided had already worked itself out in the world. What he let go of on that mountain was not the love of his country, or the care for his people, or the commitment to the Dharma he would spend his remaining years teaching. He let go of the belief that his Tam's constant activity was the thing holding it all together. That belief is very common. You may recognize it in yourself tonight, the sense that if you simply remain alert enough, attentive enough, if the mind continues its review and its rehearsal and its governance, that somehow the things you care about will be safer. But the stream does not need your governance. The breath does not need your supervision. The night will pass, whether or not the Tam maintains its watch through it. Letting go is not the abandonment of what matters. It is the discovery that what matters does not require your continuous grip in order to remain true. This is what tonight offers you. Not the silence of a mind that has been successfully quieted. The Tam does not become silent on a schedule. What tonight offers is the same thing the mountain offered him, the discovery that the listening is already present. That beneath the mind's governance of whatever it is currently reviewing, there is a quality of awareness that is simply here, simply attending, not requiring anything to be different before it agrees to be present. The sound of the breath moving is here. The weight of the body against whatever is beneath it is here. The particular quality of darkness in this room at this hour is here. None of these things need you to evaluate them or improve them or ensure they are occurring correctly. They are simply occurring, and you can simply be with them, not as an achievement, not as a practice you are performing correctly, but as the recognition of what is already the case. Let your jaw soften now. The teeth releasing from their held position. The forehead smoothing across the brow. The shoulders dropping the last distance they have been maintaining against gravity all through this day and evening. The Tam will continue its business. This is what Tam does. And there is no need to make it wrong for doing it. But the listening is also here. The awareness prior to the performance is also here. It was here before you arrived at this moment. And it will remain after you have passed through it. What you are holding tonight, whatever it is, can be held more lightly. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Not pretended away. Held more lightly. The way the mountain holds the bamboo, present, available, entirely there, and also entirely untroubled by the wind moving through it. The bamboo bends. The mountain does not notice. The wind passes. The bamboo returns. The breath is the bamboo. The Tam is the wind. You, the listening. The awareness prior to the reviewing, you are the mountain. The mountain does not chase the wind or resist it. The mountain simply remains, and the wind does what wind does. And in the morning, the bamboo is still there. Just this breath bending and returning. Just this mountain of awareness. Present, not going anywhere. Just the stream moving through the dark in the direction it has always moved, requiring nothing from you in exchange for the sound it makes. And as the cloud settles back over Yente Mountain, as the sound of that stream in the pre-dawn darkness fades back into the forest it came from, we move now toward a different kind of stillness. Westward across the sea, to Japan in the 13th century, to a winter night in a monastery south of Kyoto, where snow was falling on the garden stones and the paper screens, and a young master sat with an inkstone and a clean sheet of paper in the lamplight. And a student had just asked him a question he had been waiting his whole life to be asked. A question about the self, about what remains of the self when you have spent years studying it, and still it has not resolved into the peace you hoped it would provide. What Dogen wrote in answer to that question is still being read 8 centuries later. But what matters for tonight is not what he wrote. It is the quality of silence he was sitting inside before he began. If you are drifting now, let yourself drift. The stories will find you wherever you are. Snow falls differently in different kinds of silence. The snow that falls through the silence of a city at 2 in the morning falls through the silence of stopped traffic and shuttered shops and the particular quiet of human activity suspended. The snow that falls through a forest falls through a silence that was already there before the snow began. And the snow that falls in the garden of a mountain monastery in 13th century Japan falls through a silence that has been cultivated deliberately, maintained as part of the practice, preserved in the same way that the monastic code preserves every other element of the form as a container for what cannot be explained, only inhabited. In the winter of 1240, Kosho Horinji Monastery stood at the edge of the hills in Fukakusa, south of Kyoto, a complex of wooden halls built in the Chinese Chan style that its founder had brought back from 4 years of study on the mainland. The monastery had been established 7 years earlier, and in those 7 years it had accumulated something that no building ordinance could specify, a quality of attention. The monks who practiced there had learned to move through the corridors and the meditation hall and the kitchen and the garden with a particular care that was not the care of people trying to avoid mistakes, but the care of people who understand that the way a thing is done is not separate from the thing itself. The brush that sweeps the snow from the entrance path, swept in the correct way, is also the practice. The water ladled from the barrel at dawn, ladled with full attention, is also the practice. There is no division, Dogen taught, between the life you are living and the wisdom you are seeking. The life you are living is the only place the wisdom exists. Hai Dogen was 40 years old in the winter of 1240, and he had been teaching for 17 years since returning from China with the Dharma transmission of Master Rujing and a realization that he described in exactly 2 characters, Shinjin Datsuraku, body and mind, dropped away. He had not found those words himself. He had heard them in a pre-dawn meditation session at Mount Tiantong, heard them in Rujing's voice, directed at a monk who had fallen asleep in Zazen. And they had passed through him with the force of something that does not arrive gradually but simply is suddenly true. The boundary between the self and the 10,000 things had dissolved. Not theoretically, but actually. Not as a philosophical conclusion, but as a direct experience of how reality is when you stop being a self that is observing it from outside. He had carried grief before he had words for it. His father had died when Dogen was too early enough that the absence was simply the texture of ordinary life, the shape of the world as it had always been. His mother had died in the winter when he was 7, in Kyoto, and he had stood at her funeral watching the incense smoke rising and dissolving, and had understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things before they have been taught not to, that the smoke had been something and was now nothing, and that the distinction between the something and the nothing was not where he had assumed it was. The smoke did not fight its own dissolution. It did not resist becoming air. It simply continued being what it was, fire made visible for a moment, then released back into the invisibility from which it had briefly emerged. He had not yet had words for what he understood at that funeral. He would spend the next 46 years finding the words, and the words he found pressed into paper with a brush. At a writing table in Kyoto, or in the remote mountains of Ekitsun, or on the cold evenings of Kosho, Ji's winter are still being studied 8 centuries after the hand that wrote them stopped moving. At 13 he had been ordained on Mount Hiei, the mountain above Kyoto that housed the center of Tendai Buddhism in Japan. He had been a serious student, applying himself to the Tendai curriculum with the kind of attention that emerges from genuine urgency rather than academic ambition. But somewhere in the years of his studies, a question had come to him that the mountain could not answer. The Tendai school, taught as Mahayana Buddhism, generally teaches that all sentient beings already possess Buddha nature. Enlightenment is not something external that must be acquired. It is the fundamental nature of awareness itself, already complete, already present, already fully here. And from this central teaching, Dogen extracted a question that seemed simple and was devastating. If all beings already possess Buddha nature, if enlightenment is already the case, then why did the Buddha practice? Why did he sit beneath the Bodhi tree? Why do monks sit in meditation for thousands of hours, study for decades, to maintain precepts with such care? If the answer is already fully present, what is the question that practice is supposed to be answering? No one on Mount Hiei could answer this to his satisfaction. He left the mountain at 17, found his way to the first Zen monastery in Japan, studied for 6 years, crossed the East China Sea to China at 23, spent 4 years searching before arriving at Mount Tiantong and the teacher who would show him, not by answering his question but by producing in him an experience that made the question unnecessary. He returned to Japan in 1227 with the answer: practice is not a means to enlightenment. Practice is enlightenment. The sitting is the arrival. The washing of the bowl is the teaching. The snow that falls in the garden is the Dharma, completely expressed, not pointing at anything beyond itself. This is the understanding he was holding in 1240 when a young monk named Jian came to him on a winter evening in the Koshoji meditation hall. Gian had arrived at the monastery the previous year, among a group of students who had followed their teacher Ekan to practice with Dogen. He was an earnest practitioner, consistent in his practice, careful in his conduct, genuinely motivated by something deeper than the desire to accumulate spiritual credentials. He was also, in the winter of 1240, carrying a version of Dogen's original question, the same question that had driven a grieving child into 40 years of searching. He came to Dogen in the hour after evening, Zazen, when the monastery was settling into its night quiet. The lamps in the meditation hall had been reduced to a single flame. Outside, snow had been falling since the afternoon, and the garden shaped by Dogen with the care he brought to everything. The arrangement of stones, the placement of the lantern, the particular relationship between the old pine and the wall was under snow now. its forms simplified and made equal by the white accumulation. "I have been sitting for 7 years," Gien said. He was not complaining. There was no self-pity in his voice. He was reporting a fact and asking, with the delicacy that the formal relationship between student and teacher requires, for help understanding what the fact meant. And I noticed that I am still here, still watching myself sit, still aware of being the one who is sitting rather than simply sitting. I have studied the Genjo Koan. I understand that to study the self is to forget the self. But when I sit, the self does not forget itself. It watches. It assesses. It reports to me on the quality of its sitting. How does a person forget the self that is always doing the remembering? Dogen was quiet for a long time. Not theatrical patience, genuine consideration. He was allowing the question to settle into the quality of attention he brought to this moment, the way the snow outside was settling into the garden without rush, finding its level, covering equally what it covered. He got up without speaking and slid open the shoji screen that faced the garden. The cold came in. The sound of the snow came in, not a sound exactly, more like the quality of hearing that accompanies something muffled and softening. The garden was barely visible in the lamplight from the hall. Its shape simplified to white curves and dark verticals, where the pine and the stone and the old wooden lantern post emerged from the accumulation. He stood at the opening for a while. Then he said, "Watch the snowfall." Gien moved to stand beside him, and they watched together. The snow was not dramatic. It was falling, as snow falls when no wind moves it straight down through the dark air, visible in the small circle of lamplight and invisible beyond it. Each flake was its own falling. There was no self in the snow doing the falling. There was only the falling, continuous, the flakes not aware of being observed, not aware of being snow, not aware of anything, only falling. The way things fall when there is nothing preventing them. The snow does not remember to fall, Dogen said. It does not observe itself falling and report to itself on the quality of the falling. It falls. This is all. Gien was quiet. You are not doing it wrong. Dogen continued, his voice unchanged from the tone he used for ordinary conversation. The self that watches the sitting is real. It is not an error. But it is not the whole of what is sitting. When you hold a stone in your hand, the stone is aware of nothing. But the stone is fully here. The stone is completely itself. Nothing is missing from the stone. Now, what would it mean for you to be as fully here as the stone doll, without the stone's absence of awareness? That is the question the Genjo Koan is pointing toward. Not the absence of the self, the presence of everything else, the 10,000 things, arriving as they arrive, without your management of their arrival. He closed the shoji screen. The cold receded. The single lamp continued. The self that watches will not be silenced by watching it, Dogen said. It will not be argued out of its watching, but it can be forgotten. Not suppressed, forgotten. The way you forget your own breathing in the moment when you hear something unexpected, when a sound from outside the hall interrupts the watching, and for one moment there is only the sound, and in that moment the watcher is not there. And yet you are there, more there than when the watcher was watching. That is the moment the Genjo Koan describes. Not an achievement, a recognition. Gien returned to his cell. He sat for a long time with the snow falling outside his window. With the quality of attention that Dogen had demonstrated, rather than explained the quality of the open screen. The garden. The falling that requires nothing of the observer in exchange for its occurring. The Genjo Koan begins with what appears to be a series of contradictions and resolves them in a passage that has been studied and translated in dozens of languages in the 8 centuries since Dogen wrote it. The key passage, the one Jian had quoted, reads, "To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things of the universe." The phrase is not an instruction in the ordinary sense. It is a description of something that happens, not something you do, but something that occurs when the conditions are right. The way snow falls when the temperature is right and the moisture in the air is sufficient. You cannot make snow fall by willing it. You can arrange the conditions and then allow what happens to happen. This distinction between effort that arranges and effort that forces is what Dogen's entire life was spent trying to clarify. The question he had carried from Mount Hiei, why practice if enlightenment is already present, was answered not by an argument, but by an experience that made the argument unnecessary. And what the experience showed was something precise, that the self, which is trying to achieve enlightenment, and the enlightenment it is trying to achieve, are not two separate things waiting to be joined. They were never separate. The self that seeks is made of the same awareness as the enlightenment it seeks. The wave does not need to travel to reach the ocean. The wave is already the ocean, moving in a particular way. But the self does not experience itself this way. The self experiences itself as a separate watcher, standing outside the 10,000 things and observing them, judging them, managing its relationship to them. This position, the position of the manager, the assessor, the planner, is not wrong. It is necessary for ordinary life. But it is not the whole of what a person is. And when it becomes the whole, when the self and its watching become the only thing happening, then the 10,000 things close out. The snow falls on the other side of the screen. The body in the meditation hall becomes an object to be observed rather than a presence to be inhabited. The breath becomes a variable to be monitored rather than a movement to be joined. What Dogen's life demonstrates is not the path of someone who suppressed the self through ferocious spiritual discipline. It is the path of someone who brought such full and continuous attention to the present moment that the self, for lack of any drama to sustain it, simply dissolved, not suppressed, not conquered, simply no longer necessary. To forget the self is not to become empty. It is to become available to the snow falling, to the sound of the ladle against the barrel, to the quality of the winter air when the shoji screen is opened and the cold comes in with all the authority of something that does not require your permission to be what it is. This applies directly to this night. The self that cannot rest is usually the self that is watching the person who cannot rest, assessing the situation, determining the degree of the problem, calculating the hours remaining before morning. This watching is real. It is not wrong, but it is not the whole of what is present in this room right now. What else is present? The weight of the body against the surface beneath it present, not requiring assessment. The air entering the nose, slightly cooler than the air inside the room present, not requiring management. The texture of whatever the hands are resting on the weave of a blanket, the smoothness of a sheet, the temperature of the fabric in the places where it has been warmed by the body, all of this present, fully, without any effort from the watching self to make it so. When the self steps back from its watching for a moment, not suppressed, not conquered, simply for a moment no longer necessary, what remains is the 10,000 things arriving. The weight, the air, the darkness, the breath, moving with the authority of something that does not require your permission to continue. This is not a special state. It is simply what is already here when the watching pulls back far enough to allow it to be noticed. Let your eyes release now. Whatever tension is held in them, let the space behind the forehead open slightly, as though the thinking that has been filling it could drift toward the edges and allow a small clearing in the center. Not forced. Not a technique. The way snow settles without rush, without correction, finding its own level in the spaces that are available to it. The breath is falling the way snow falls in that garden. Not because you have gotten it right, not because the watching self has successfully managed the conditions, because falling is what breath does when nothing prevents it. And tonight, nothing needs to prevent it. Just the falling, just the darkness, completely itself. Just the body, arriving at this moment, the way the 10,000 things arrive when the watcher steps back far enough to allow them fully, without anything missing, not pointing toward anything beyond the simple fact of being here. If your eyes are closing, let them close. The stories will find you wherever you are. You do not need to stay awake to receive what they carry. The breath will continue its falling whether or not the watching self is present to observe it. The 10,000 things will continue arriving, the weight of the body, the temperature of the air, the quiet of this particular hour, whether or not you are managing their arrival. They have been arriving all along. They will be here when the watcher steps aside. They will be here when sleep comes. They will be here in the morning, exactly as they are now, complete, fully themselves, not pointing anywhere beyond this moment. And as the winter night at Angkor Monastery dissolves back into its snow and its single lamp, as the garden returns to its whiteness and its silence, the pine and the stone and the old lantern post standing in their own completeness, asking nothing of anyone who might be watching, we travel now to a different kind of sky. To the mountains of South Korea, where a monk once sat for 10 years without speaking, without leaving, without naming himself anything, and discovered in that long stillness that the sky holds everything that passes through it, without ever being changed by what passes. The Palgong Mountains rise northeast of Daegu in the southern part of the Korean peninsula, their granite ridges running in long parallel lines above a landscape of cedar forest and terraced hillsides and the small farming villages that have occupied the valleys between them for as long as anyone can trace. In autumn, the deciduous trees on the lower slopes turn through a sequence of colors: amber, rust, deep red that the granite peaks above them do not participate in. The grey stone unchanged through the season, maintaining through all weathers the same quality of permanence that has no interest in any particular year or any particular argument. Partway up one of the ridges in the Palgong Range, reached by a path that was not particularly maintained and was not intended to encourage visitors, stood a small wooden hermitage called Seon Chol. It had been a hermitage for generations before the monk who occupied it in the late 1950s arrived, a place where practitioners came to do solitary retreat work, returning periodically to Yeshe Temple on the lower slopes to receive supplies and, when their retreat period was complete, to return to the ordinary life of the monastery. The hermitage itself was simple in the way that places become simple when no one is trying to make them comfortable. A single room with a wooden floor, a low writing desk, a shelf for texts, paper screens over the windows that in winter let in the cold and the grey light in approximately equal measure. In the year 1955, the monk who would become Seon Chol moved into this hermitage and surrounded it with barbed wire. not to keep anyone out in an aggressive sense, to make the boundary of his world visible, physical, undeniable. A declaration: this is the perimeter. Inside this perimeter, I will do what needs to be done. For 10 years, he did not cross it. The president of South Korea came to the base of the mountain. Word was sent up to the hermitage that the president wished to greet him. Seon Chol sent word back. He would be pleased to receive the president, who should first perform 3,000 prostrations before the Buddha in the main hall. The president declined. The two never met. Seon Chol remained inside the perimeter. 10 years is a long time by any measure. It is long enough for the political situation of a country to reverse itself entirely, for children to grow into adults, for the cedars outside the hermitage windows to add several years of new growth to their trunks and to change very slightly, imperceptibly, unless you looked with care across years rather than weeks, the quality of light that came through them in the morning. A person who sat in one room for 10 years, watching the light change through the same windows across 420 seasons, would come to know something about permanence and impermanence that is very difficult to know in any other way. From inside the hermitage, Seon Chol could watch this happen. He was watching many things. He was also, in the way that long practice makes possible, watching the watching. He had been born in 1912, the eldest son of a Confucian scholar in Gyeongsang province, in a household where serious intellectual work was the ordinary business of a day. By the age of 3, he could read. By 10, he was moving through the classical Chinese texts that his father's library held, the great histories, the philosophical collections, the novels that encoded the entire moral and cosmological system of Confucian civilization in narrative form. He was a child for whom ideas were not abstract but urgent, the question of how to live, of what the self was, of whether the fear that arrived in the early morning hours and refused to name itself was something to be explained or something to be worked with directly. These were not philosophical exercises for him. They were the texture of ordinary experience. He was in his early 20s when a monk showed him a Tang dynasty text called the Song of Enlightenment, written by the Chan master Yongjia Xuanzhu. He would say later in life that reading it felt as though a bright light had suddenly been lit in a place of complete darkness, not a gradual illumination, but an instantaneous shift. The world, the same world, and somehow entirely different. He went to a temple and began to practice the Mu Huadu, holding the question Mu in the mind without seeking conceptual resolution, allowing the question to do its work directly rather than through the mediation of intellectual analysis. He practiced so intensively that within 42 days he had attained what Korean Seon calls Dongjong Ilyo, consistency of practice through both movement and stillness. To the Huadu, alive, whether the body is sitting or walking, working or resting. He received ordination in the spring of 1937 at Hainsa, the ancient temple at the foot of Gyesan Mountain that housed the entire Tripitaka Koreana, 81,000 wooden printing blocks carved with the complete Buddhist scripture, stored in halls whose ventilation had been so intelligently designed when they were built in the 14th century that the woodblocks had survived 600 years without the deterioration that should, by the physics of wood and moisture and temperature variation, have destroyed them long ago. The halls had survived 7 major fires, an invasion, and a direct order from a military officer to bomb them during the Korean War, an order the pilot refused, because he had been told what was stored inside. Seon Chol would spend the last decades of his life at Hainsa, presiding over those woodblocks and the tradition they carried, becoming the patriarch of the monastery and then the supreme patriarch of the entire yogi order of Korean Buddhism. But in 1955, he was 43 years old, and all of that was not yet determined. What was determined was the barbed wire, the hermitage, and the 10 years. He practiced through the years before that arrival with the same intensity he had brought to the original 42 days. For 7 consecutive years, from 1940 to 47, he sat without lying down, sasifilsyong, the practice of refusing the body, the horizontal position, maintaining the upright posture through every hour of every day and every hour of every night. The body learning to rest in the upright position when rest was unavoidable, but never in lying. For someone who had taught himself to read at 3 and was moving through Chinese classical texts at 10, the intellectual dimension of the practice was also ferocious. He was studying modern physics alongside the ancient sutras, finding in Einstein's formulations of mass energy equivalence a vocabulary for what Buddhist philosophy had been pointing toward for centuries. By the time he arrived at Seongjonam Hermitage in 1955, he had been practicing with a ferocity and a consistency that most practitioners would consider beyond the range of the humanly sustainable. He was not finished. He was, in some important sense, just beginning the beginning that comes after the preliminary work has been done, when the practitioner arrives at the question beneath all the other questions, the one that cannot be answered by additional effort, but only by a quality of sustained, undefended presence. The hermitage in the Palgong Mountains was where he was going to practice that presence for 10 years. In the 3rd year of his solitary retreat, a young monk from Pagyesa Temple came up the mountain path with the monthly supply of rice and dried vegetables. His name was Wanhei, and he had been at Pagyesa for 2 years, practicing under a teacher who had trained with some of the older masters of the Seon tradition. He was 24 years old, earnest, and carrying in the way that earnest practitioners often carry things slightly carefully, as though the question itself were fragile, a concern he had not been able to set down through 2 years of practice. He set the supplies at the gate of the barbed wire perimeter and waited. After a time, Seon Chol came to the gate. He was dressed in the ordinary robes of a Korean Buddhist monk, his head shaved, his expression the expression of a person who has nothing in particular to prove. He looked at the young monk and waited. "I have a question," Wanhei said, "if you will receive it." Seon Chol made a small gesture that indicated willingness to hear. "I have been practicing for 2 years," Wanhei said, "and what I notice is that when worry comes, when the mind produces a thought about the future or the past or something unresolved, I become the worry. I do not have a worry. I become it. And I have tried to return to the Huadu when this happens. And sometimes it works. And sometimes the worry is larger than the Huadu, and I cannot find the space between myself and the anxious thought. I want to know, how does a practitioner create that space?" Seon Chol was quiet for a moment. He looked past the young monk at the valley below, where the autumn colors on the lower slopes were visible from this elevation as a broad pattern of amber and rust against the gray-green of the cedars. The sky above the ridge was the particular deep blue of Korean autumn. "You are asking the wrong question," Seon Chol said. His voice was direct without being unkind. Wanhei waited. "You ask how to create space between yourself and the anxious thought," Seon Chol continued. "But creating space between yourself and the thought assumes that you are one thing and the thought is another thing, and that the problem is the distance or lack of distance between them. This is not the problem." He paused. "The problem is that you believe the thought is you." Wanhei was quiet, Look at the sky, Seon Chol said. Wonhye looked up. The autumn sky above the Palgong Ridge was very clear. The clouds that passed through it, Seon Chol said. Does the sky become the cloud? No. Does the sky fight the cloud? No. Does the sky try to create space between itself and the cloud? A longer pause. No. The cloud appears. The cloud is real. The cloud moves through the sky. The sky remains. The sky does not ask itself whether it is sky, or whether the cloud changes what it is, or whether this cloud is worse than the last cloud. The sky does not practice creating distance from the cloud. The sky simply is what it is before the cloud, during the cloud, after the cloud, the same sky, unchanged in its fundamental nature by any weather that passes through it. He let this sit. Now, Seon Chol said. What are you? Wonhye did not answer immediately. The question was not asking for a philosophical definition. It was asking for something that philosophical definition cannot reach: the direct recognition of what is present before the anxious thought and what remains after it. The thought of worry is real, Seon Chol continued. It arises in the mind. It has content. It refers to something actual, a future that is uncertain, a relationship that is unresolved, a question about the path that has not yet answered itself. The thought is not wrong to arise. The thought is not the enemy, but the thought is a cloud. And when you say you become the worry, what is happening is that the sky is mistaking itself for the cloud. The sky is looking at the cloud and saying, "This is what I am. This is my nature. I am a worrying sky." And from that identification, everything follows. The urgency to resolve the worry. The fear that the worry will not resolve. The exhaustion of being the thing that is worried rather than the space in which the worry appears. Wonhye came back to the Hermitage Gate 6 more times over the following year. Each time Seon Chol received him briefly, never for long. Always with the directness of someone who trusts the student to work with what has been given. The conversations were short. The work they catalyzed was not. On the second visit, Wonhye asked, "But what if the cloud is very large? What if it fills the entire sky?" Seon Chol looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Has the sky ever been made smaller by a cloud?" Wonhye went back down the mountain with that question and sat with it for 3 weeks. On the third visit, he did not ask anything. He simply stood at the gate. Seon Chol came out, looked at him, and said, "You are making progress. Before, you came with questions. Now you come with the question itself." Then he went back inside. Wonhye stood at the gate for a while longer, then went back down the mountain. And something in the quality of the sitting that followed was different, not quieter, not easier, but less divided. There was still a watcher. There was still the anxious review of whether the practice was proceeding correctly. But there was also something that had always been present and was now slightly more frequently noticed. The thing that was watching the watcher, which was not troubled by any of the watching. What Seon Chol was pointing toward in those brief exchanges was a distinction that Korean Seon regards as fundamental. The distinction between what arises in awareness and what is aware. Thoughts arise in awareness. Feelings arise in awareness. Anxious thoughts about uncertain futures arise in awareness. But awareness itself, the sky in which all of this appears, does not arise. It does not come and go. It is present before the first thought of the morning and after the last thought of the night. It is present during the worry and during the relief and during the states between, that have no particular name. It is not produced by practice and cannot be damaged by the absence of practice. It is simply the nature of what you are, the sky that does not ask itself if it is sky, that does not negotiate with clouds, that holds everything that passes through it without being changed by any of it. This matters tonight because the thought that is present in the dark, the anxious review, the uncertain future, the question without an answer is a cloud. It is real. Its content may refer to something actual and important, but it is arising in something, and that something is not the thought. That something is the awareness that is present right now, in this moment, in this room, noticing the thought the way the sky notices the cloud, simply, without urgency, without needing the cloud to leave before the sky can be what it is. You are not the worry. You have a worry. These are different statements, and the difference between them is not semantic. When you are the worry, everything that follows from it is personal and urgent. This worry must be resolved. This worry means something has gone fundamentally wrong with the night or with your life. When you have a worry, when the worry is a cloud moving through the sky rather than the sky itself, the worry can be exactly what it is, moving exactly as it moves. While the sky remains what it always was, spacious, unchanged, holding the cloud without becoming it. This is not a practice of indifference. Seon Chol was not indifferent. He sat for 7 years without lying down. He surrounded himself with barbed wire for 10 years and chose to remain inside the boundary he had created. He refused the president of his country because the practice mattered more than political courtesy. None of this is the behavior of someone who has simply stopped caring. It is the behavior of someone who has learned to care from the sky rather than from the cloud, who brings full attention to the content of life without losing the awareness that the content is passing through something that does not change. The cloud that is present tonight, whatever thought or worry is moving through the dark, is moving through the same sky that held every other cloud you have ever had. Every fear that eventually resolved, every night that eventually became morning, every impossible situation that turned out to be survivable. They all moved through the same sky. And the sky is here now, unchanged before the thought, and during the thought, and after the thought, holding everything without being altered by anything it holds. The sky does not need to create distance from the cloud. The sky simply is what it is. You simply are what you are, the awareness present in this room right now, noticing whatever is arising, not changed by what it notices, not diminished by the difficulty of what passes through it. The practice Seon Chol spent 10 years refining in the Palgong Mountains is not the practice of eliminating difficult mental content. It is the practice of recognizing what you are, what is actually present here, in this darkness, before the labeling of the mental content begins. Before this is called worry, or relief, or uncertainty, or fear. Before the sky mistakes itself for the cloud, what is present? There is awareness. There is the knowing of this moment, not the content of the thought, but the bare fact of being present to whatever is arising. There is the sense of the body, held, warm in whatever is surrounding it. There is the breath, moving in its own rhythm, not asking to be labeled or evaluated. There is the darkness, which is simply dark, not threatening and not safe, but simply the quality of light that this particular hour carries. All of this is present before the next thought arrives. All of this will be present after the thought dissolves. The sky does not change with the weather. What you are does not change with the thought. Let the shoulders drop now. Let the jaw open slightly. the teeth separating, the muscles of the face releasing across the brow and around the eyes. The body, in this moment, is a body resting. The sky, in this moment, is simply sky. Whatever clouds are present, let them be clouds. Moving through, arriving, passing, dissolving in their own time. The sky does not chase them. The sky simply continues to be the sky, unchanged, just the sky, just the awareness, present, not going anywhere, just the breath, a cloud moving through it in and out and in again. Just this. If you are drifting, drift. The stories will find you wherever you are. And as the Palgong Mountains recede behind us, as the barbed wire perimeter of that small hermitage fades back into the cedar forest and the autumn sky that does not change, we move now towards something older. Southward from Korea, across the sea, to the island of Java in the 8th century, where an enormous structure was being built by thousands of hands that did not know they were building something that would still be standing 1,200 years later. People who carved stone in the early morning before the heat came, not knowing whose eyes would eventually rest on what their chisels had made. The stone is grey andesite. This is important to know. Andesite is a volcanic rock formed from magma that cooled quickly, dense with minerals that have arranged themselves into a fine crystalline matrix, harder than sandstone and softer than granite, capable of holding a carved edge through centuries of monsoon rain and dry season heat without losing the precision of the line. The men who cut it understood its properties through the accumulated knowledge of generations of stoneworkers. Through the particular way the chisel sounds against it in the early morning, when the air is cool and the stone is at its most cooperative. And through the subtle visual signal, a slight change in how the surface accepts light that tells an experienced carver that the stone has given as much in this direction as it will give today and needs to be approached from a different angle tomorrow. In central Java, in the 8th century of the Common Era, there was enough andesite in the riverbeds and the outcroppings of the Menore Hills to build something the scale of which had not been attempted in this part of the world before. The stone was cut in pieces, blocks of various sizes, none of them precisely regular, fitted together without mortar by the geometry of their interlocking weight. 2.5 million cubic feet of stone, 75 years of work, thousands of workers at any given time, organized in the fashion of the Sailendra Royal Workshops, specialists in cutting, specialists in transport, specialists in fitting, specialists in the carved bas-relief work that would eventually cover the structure's walls and balustrades in an unbroken sequence of narrative panels running, if laid end to end, for nearly 3 miles. No one recorded the names of the people who carved those panels. Not one name. What remains is the work itself, 2,672 individual carved panels, each one depicting a scene from the life of the Buddha, from the Jataka tales of his previous lives, from the daily life of 8th century Java as observed by the people who were living it, a marketplace with a woman selling fruit, a ship with outrigger floats, riding a sea that has been rendered in stylized waves, a king receiving petitioners in a courtyard, a forest hermit seated in meditation beneath a tree whose leaves have been carved with enough specificity to identify the species. The people who carved these scenes were not illustrating text they had memorized. They were carving the world they saw every day, translated into the symbolic vocabulary of the Dharma. Imagine one of them. His name, in this story, is Karna. He has no historical record. He belongs to the tradition in the way that many of the most important elements of any tradition belong to it, not as a documented individual, but as the representative of a reality that was certainly present, even if no document preserved his specific name. He was a stone carver, third generation, the son and grandson of stone carvers who had worked on the Hindu temples in the same valley. He had been brought to the Borobudur construction when he was 19, recruited by the Sailendra overseers who moved through the region, selecting craftsmen with the particular combination of skill, endurance, and disposition toward long, precise work that the project required. He was 31 years old when the story takes place. He had been working on the 5th level of the structure for 3 years, carving the narrative panels that depicted scenes from the Jataka tales, the 547 stories of the Buddha's previous lives, told across the walls of the monument's lower terraces in a sequence meant to be walked counterclockwise as the pilgrim ascended, moving through the entire cosmological narrative of Buddhism's understanding of time and the soul's long journey through it. The panels he was currently carving depicted a story he knew well, a prince who gave away everything he had, including his children and his wife, because he understood that attachment was the source of suffering and that generosity without limit was the highest expression of the Bodhisattva path. The panel was not about approving of this choice or disapproving. It was about rendering the moment of giving, the moment when a hand releases what it has held, in stone, precise enough to be understood 12 centuries later. Karna worked in the early morning. This was universal among the carvers. The stone was at its best before the equatorial heat built up through the afternoon hours, and the light in the morning came at an angle that made the relief work visible in a way the harsh midday light did not. He arrived at his section of the wall before dawn, when the sky above the Kedu plain to the east was still dark, and the air carried the particular moisture of a Javanese night, heavy with the smell of rice paddies and vegetation, and the faint mineral trace of volcanic soil that underlies everything in this part of Java. He ate a small amount of rice with palm sugar, drank water from the clay vessel his wife refilled each evening, and waited for the light. The tools were simple: a pointed iron punch for the initial rough blocking of the image, progressively finer chisels for the detail work, a wooden mallet whose weight he had calibrated over years of use to deliver exactly the force required without overthinking each strike. The mallet's handle was worn in the places where his hand gripped it daily, the wood darkened by years of absorbed sweat and the particular oils of human skin. He could identify his own mallet in the dark by the feel of its handle. When the light came first, the diffuse grey of pre-dawn, then the pale gold of the first direct light clearing the horizon, he began. The panel he was working on depicted the prince at the moment of release. The prince's hand was extended, open, the gift already given, the face carrying the expression that the carver had been attempting to render for 6 weeks without quite achieving it. Not grief, not relief. Something more complex, the expression of a person who has done the hardest possible thing and discovered, in the doing of it, that the doing was itself the arrival, that what they were looking for was not on the other side of the action but inside the action itself. Getting this expression right required Karna to work more slowly than usual. He had learned over 12 years that the best work happened when he was not thinking about the expression, when he was attending to the specific piece of stone in front of the specific tool in his hand in this specific moment, with the specific quality of light available to him right now, and in that specificity, the expression appeared. Not made, found. On the morning of the day this story is about, he had been working for 2 hours in the good early light when the stone gave him something he had not expected. He had been working the left side of the prince's face, the cheekbone, the line beneath the eye, the slight hollowing of the temple that gives a face the quality of having endured something without being destroyed by it, when a small piece of the andesite separated from the surface in a way that had not been planned. Not a disaster. Carvers of long experience learned to distinguish between fractures that were failures and fractures that were offerings. This one was an offering. The stone's grain had run in a slightly different direction than the visual surface had suggested. He stopped and looked at what had happened. The unplanned separation had produced a slight concavity in the cheek, a shadow that had not been in the original design, but that gave the face a quality of interior depth that the design, in its flatness, had lacked. The face suddenly had a quality of looking inward rather than outward. The expression had become, without Kana planning it, the expression of someone who has just understood something they had been trying to understand for a very long time. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. The light had shifted. The early gold of the first direct sun had moved to a slightly higher angle, and the shadow in the unplanned concavity was already different from what it had been 10 minutes earlier. The expression would look different again by noon. Different again in late afternoon when the low western light came in from a different direction entirely. The face he had found this morning would not look like this face at any other time of day. It was a morning face. A specific quality of morning light face. And it would only be precisely this for the next hour or so before the light moved on. He continued working. The afternoon brought the heat that always came in this season, the air thickening, the stone warming under the sun until it was unpleasant to touch with bare hands, the light becoming too harsh and too flat for fine detail work. He stopped at the time he always stopped, washed the stone dust from his hands and arms, and sat for a time looking at the panel from the distance that lets a carver see what the approach prevents. The prince's face was not finished. It would require perhaps 3 more weeks of morning sessions to bring it to the point where the overseers would accept it and mark it complete. But the essential quality of the expression was there found, not made, in the unplanned concavity of a morning's work. He would now work toward it rather than toward the design he had originally planned. He did not think about whether the panel would survive. That was not a category available to him. The structure was being built. He was one of the people building it. What would happen to the structure over the centuries that followed its completion was simply not within the frame of reference that a craftsman in central Java in the 8th century would bring to a day's work. The frame was the stone, the tool, the light, the image to be rendered. The frame was sufficient. That night, lying in the sleeping area of the workers' quarters with the particular exhaustion of a body that has held a precise position for hours doing precise work, he was aware of the quality of silence that descends on a large construction site after work has stopped for the day. The site was never entirely quiet. There were watchmen. There were animals. There was the sound of the river to the east. But the particular sound of thousands of human beings engaged in coordinated physical effort was absent now. And in its absence, the site had a different quality than it had during the day, less purposeful, more itself. More simply, the collection of stone and earth and carved surface that it actually was, without the human intention that animated it daily. He thought about the prince's face, not about whether it was good, about the moment when the stone had decided for him what it needed to be, about the way that 12 years of learning to hold a chisel at the correct angle, to read the grain of the stone before striking, to anticipate what the andesite would offer and what it would refuse, how all of that learning had made possible a moment of not knowing. The fracture that produced the concavity was not something he had caused by skill. It was something his skill had made him capable of receiving. He had been listening to the stone long enough that when the stone spoke, he heard it. There was something here that was larger than the craft, though it could not have been accessed without the craft. Something about the relationship between attention and outcome. The panel was better for the unplanned fracture than it would have been without it. And the unplanned fracture was possible only because he had shown up for 12 years to do the work of listening to what the stone wanted to give. This is what the Borobudur panels carry. 12 centuries after the hands that made them have dissolved entirely into the ground of central Java, not the names of the makers, not the ambitions of the makers, not even the specific intentions of the makers in any moment that can now be reconstructed. What they carry is the quality of attention that a human being brings to a specific piece of stone, in a specific quality of morning light, with a specific tool whose handle has been worn by years of the same hand. The attention is fully there. The name is not there. The distinction between the two things, the attention and the person whose attention it was, has collapsed in the most complete possible way. This contact, this quality of full attention given to what is immediately present, does not require the project to be finished in order to be complete. The moment of contact is always complete in itself. The morning light on the prince's face is complete in itself. The sound of the chisel against andesite, in the cool early air before the equatorial heat builds, is complete in itself. Nothing about the incompleteness of the larger project diminishes the completeness of this contact. In this moment, between this attention and this stone, Karna did not know that his panel would survive. He did not know that the structure would be abandoned within 2 centuries of its completion, buried under volcanic ash, invisible for 1,000 years. He did not know that a British colonial officer would order its excavation in 1814, or that millions of people would walk past his panel and feel, without being able to say why, that the expression on the prince's face contains something true about the experience of letting go. He only knew the stone and the tool and the light and the quality of attention he could bring to the morning's work. That was sufficient. That has always been sufficient. There is a quality of rest available in this understanding that goes deeper than the rest of having figured something out. It is the rest of the hand that has set down the chisel, not because the work is finished, because the work is never finished, but because the work that was available in this moment has been done with full attention, and that completeness does not need the larger project's completion in order to be real. The incompleteness of your own unfinished things, the relationships not yet resolved, the questions not yet answered, the versions of your life not yet confirmed or denied, they do not need to be finished before this moment can be complete. This moment is the stone and the light and the tool. This moment is the breath moving, the body held, the hands resting against whatever they are resting against. The expression has already been found in the unplanned concavity of this night. You did not plan it. The grain of things ran in a slightly different direction than the design had suggested, and what appeared is better than what was planned. Let the hands open now. Uncurl the fingers if they have been curled. Let the palms rest, face down or face up, whichever feels like release rather than effort. The hands have done their work today. They can be still now. They can be just hands. Just wait. Just the ordinary fact of 2 hands resting in the ordinary dark of this hour. The breath moves. It does not ask to be remembered. It offers itself, moment by moment. The way the stone offered the unplanned concavity, not as something you made, as something that arrived in the space of your attention. And then it dissolves, and the next one arrives. And that one too is complete in itself, and requires nothing from you except that you be present for it. The work of this day is complete. The work of this moment is complete. The name does not need to be recorded. The expression has been found. The stone is holding it in the early morning light for whoever comes next. Just this. Just the chisel set down. Just the hands open. Just the breath. Arriving and releasing. Arriving and releasing, each one complete. Each one sufficient. None of them needing to be the last one before this moment can be everything it is. Just the stone of the night, holding the expression that arrived unbidden in the grain of things. Just this hour, complete in itself, not pointing toward anything beyond the simple fact of being here, of breath moving in a body held, of the light beginning its slow return somewhere beyond the edge of what can be seen from here. And as the morning light of 8th century Java fades, as the smell of the rice paddies and the volcanic soil and the grey andesite dissolves back into the darkness from which all mornings emerge, we move now toward a different kind of exile. Northward across the sea and through the centuries, to Tibet in the 14th century, where a man who had built something important was expelled from it, and who discovered, in the cave where he went to wait out the cold, that what he had built was not the thing he thought he had built at all, that what he had built was inside him, and that no expulsion could reach it. If sleep is near, let it come. You don't need to stay awake for what comes next. The mountain called Gangri Tokar stands 25 kilometers south-southwest of Lhasa, in the central Tibetan landscape of high ridgelines and river valleys, and the particular quality of light that belongs to altitudes above 4,000 meters, a light that is simultaneously thinner and more precise than the light at lower elevations, as though the reduced atmosphere has removed a layer of diffusion that elsewhere softens the edges of things. In winter, the mountain's summit ridge carries snow, and the snow is the quality of snow that forms at altitude in dry air, not the heavy wet snow of lower mountains, but a fine crystalline accumulation that responds to wind by forming shapes that look carved rather than deposited, geometric almost, as though the cold itself has been working on the surface with some kind of intention. The mountain's name translates as White Skull, Snow Mountain. The shape of the ridge, seen from a certain angle, resembles a skull, the rounded dome of the upper peak, the concavity of the rock face below it suggesting orbits, the whole form carrying that quality of ancient endurance that certain geological formations carry, a quality of having been exactly this for longer than any human category of time can comfortably hold. At the base of the upper peak, accessible by a path that requires both hands in the steeper sections, there are caves. Not large caves. The scale of Tibetan cave hermitages is almost always surprising to those who approach them with expectations formed by stories of grandeur. They are the size of a large room, or a small room, or sometimes barely the size of a person sitting. They are spaces created by the particular way the rock fractured when the mountain was young, and they have been used by practitioners for as long as there has been a practice tradition in Tibet that values solitude and altitude as conditions for certain kinds of inner work. Longchenpa was 34 years old when he arrived at the cave above the Shukseb Valley that would become his primary home for the most productive years of his life. He named it Orgyen Dzong, the fortress of Orian, the Tibetan name for Padmasambhava, the Indian master who had brought the Vajrayana teachings to Tibet 5 centuries earlier. He did not arrive at Orian Dzong because conditions were favorable. He arrived because the alternative was to remain in the institutional structures of Tibetan Buddhist learning and politics, which had become increasingly inhospitable to the particular kind of work he needed to do. His life had not followed the path that his early gifts had suggested it might. He was born in 1308 in the Dra Valley of central Tibet, the son of a Nyingma Lama and a mother whose family had connections to the great teachers of several lineages. His mother died when he was 9 years old. His father died when he was 11. The 2 deaths arrived close enough together that by the time he entered Samye Monastery in 1320, Tibet's first Buddhist monastery, the historic center of the Nyingma tradition, he had already learned something that most people require considerably more of life to learn: that the conditions which support a given way of living can be removed without warning, and that what remains afterward is whatever was actually yours rather than the surrounding framework's gift. He had an exceptional memory and an exceptional appetite for study. In 1327, at the age of 19, he transferred to Sangpo New Tok, the great learning center of central Tibet, where scholars from every Tibetan Buddhist lineage gathered to debate and study and produce the commentaries and systematic treatises that formed the intellectual infrastructure of the tradition. He spent 6 years there, absorbing not only the Nyingma teachings that were his birthright, but also the Kadam and Sakya scholastic traditions, the Kagyu tantric commentaries, the formal logic and epistemology that had been imported from the Indian universities. He studied with the third Karmapa, Rangjung Dorje, one of the most accomplished masters of the period. He was recognized by everyone who encountered him as someone whose gifts were of an unusual order, and then he left. The records say he left because of conflicts with certain scholars at Sangpo, that the institutional environment had become uncongenial in ways the sources leave incompletely described. What the sources agree on is the direction. He went toward the mountains and toward poverty. He spent the years that followed moving through the landscape of central Tibet with his teacher Rigdzin Kumaradza, a Dzogchen master who conducted his teaching in the nomadic fashion of the older tradition, traveling from valley to valley, teaching in conditions of voluntary hardship, sleeping on a mat of sacking, eating barley when barley was available, and eating nothing when it was not. For 2 years, Longchenpa received from Kumaradza all the transmissions of the Vima Nyingthig and the Khandro Nyingthig, the most profound cycles of Dzogchen practice in the Nyingma lineage, while living in greater material poverty than he had ever known. What he was receiving in those years of movement and barley and cold was something that the institutional environment of Sangpo had not been able to give him: the direct recognition that the elaborate philosophical architecture he had built in his mind was a description of something, not the thing itself. That the thing itself, what Dzogchen calls Rigpa, the natural awareness that is the fundamental nature of mind, was not a conclusion you arrived at through argument. It was something you recognized. And recognition requires a quality of stillness that scholarly debate tends to preclude. He came to Gangri Thokar sometime around 1340. In his early 30s, having received the transmissions and having spent years in retreat, and having attracted enough students that the question of where to settle had become both possible and necessary. The cave at Orian Dzong had the qualities he required: altitude sufficient to limit casual visitors, a view of the Kichu Valley below that provided the particular quality of spaciousness that Dzogchen teachers have always associated with recognition, the ability to see a vast expanse from a position of relative stability, the eye moving naturally toward openness, and enough shelter to allow year-round habitation by a person accustomed to conditions that most people would find unlivable. The winters at Gangri Tokar were cold in the specific way of high Tibetan winters, not the dramatic cold of extreme temperatures, but the sustained cold of months of grey sky and frozen ground, and the particular quality of light at high altitude in December that has no warmth in it at any angle. The sun describing its low arc across the south and making no perceptible difference to the temperature of the air or the stone. The cave's entrance faced roughly east. In the morning, the first light came directly through it, a specific quality of high-altitude morning light that is closer to pale silver than to gold. Precise and clean, touching the stone floor of the cave in a way that moved with the sun's arc and could be used by a person who had observed it long enough to estimate the time without any other reference. He worked in this light. Not always with ink and paper, the tradition he was working in was an oral tradition at its deepest level, and the most important transmissions were not textual. But in the years at Gangri Tokar, Longchenpa produced an extraordinary volume of written work, the Seven Treasuries, the Trilogy of Natural Ease, the Trilogy of Natural Freedom. More than 200 texts, composed in a cave 25 kilometers south of Lhasa, by a man who had no institutional position, no patron of certain reliability, no guarantee that what he was writing would be preserved or transmitted or read by anyone. He wrote because the understanding required transmission. That was the entire basis of the Nyingma tradition, that what was understood must be passed on. Not for the benefit of the lineage as an institution, but for the benefit of the beings who would, in some future that could not be specified, need exactly what was being preserved. Yeshe Tsogyal had hidden the terma in rock faces and hollow statues and buried beneath the earth because she understood this. Longchenpa wrote in his cave because he understood the same thing, in a different form, that the understanding of Rigpa, of natural awareness, of the fundamental nature of mind that is the same in every being, regardless of the circumstances of their life, needed a language precise enough to transmit not just information, but the conditions for recognition itself. The texts he was writing had a quality different from scholarly commentary. He had produced plenty of scholarly commentary in the years at Sangpo Precise, logically structured, formally correct arguments about the nature of the path and the relationship between the sutric and tantric approaches. That was one kind of writing, and he had done it well. What he was writing at Gangri Tokar was something else. The Seven Treasuries, the Trilogy of Natural Ease, the Trilogy of Natural Freedom. These were attempts to use language in a way that language is not naturally suited to, not to describe Rigpa from the outside, which produces philosophy, but to use the words themselves as a kind of pointing the way a finger points at the moon, so that someone reading, in the right state, in the right moment of readiness, might find that the reading produced the recognition rather than the description of the recognition. He worked on these texts in the mornings. The cave was cold enough in winter that his breath was visible in the early hours, the exhalation appearing as a small cloud and dissolving in the air before him. He worked in the specific quality of light that came through the east-facing entrance, moving, changing, marking the hours by the angle at which it touched the stone floor and the far wall. He worked without pressure and without certainty about whether what he was writing was adequate to what he was trying to transmit. The Dzogchen teachings say that Rigpa is beyond words. He was spending his mornings finding words for it anyway, because the alternative was silence. And silence, in the absence of the direct transmission of a living teacher, was not always enough. The writing sessions ended when the light moved past the angle that made the cave habitable as a workspace. Then he sat. Not in the formal posture of someone practicing something, the posture of a person for whom the distinction between practice and not practice had dissolved some years earlier. Just sitting. The The view from the cave's entrance when he looked up from the text, the Kichu Valley below, to the river, a silver thread on clear days. The mountains on the far side of the valley rising in their own gradation of grey and ochre and the particular blue of Tibetan distance. The sky above all of it, immenser, the blue that Tibetan language has a specific word for because the altitude makes the blue different here from anywhere else, deeper, more final, less interested in the human business that takes place beneath it. He was not comfortable. He was not at ease in any conventional sense of the term. He had chosen a life that required the elimination of most of what ordinary human life considers necessary, and the elimination had been thorough. But in the cave at Orian Dzong, in the specific quality of winter, morning light coming through the east-facing entrance, in the sustained cold and the sustained silence and the sustained recognition that what he was attending to in the practice could not be taken away by any of the conditions surrounding it, he was, in the Dzogchen sense, at rest. Not in the body, in the nature of the mind. This is what the teachings he was writing were attempting to transmit, that Rigpa, the natural awareness that is the fundamental nature of mind, does not depend on conditions. It is not produced by favorable circumstances or destroyed by difficult ones. It was present in the poverty and movement of the years with Kumaradza. It was present in the cave at Gangri Thoka in the winter cold. It would be present, though he did not yet know this. When the political situation in Tibet forced him to leave, when the rise of Jangchub Gyeltsen and the new Pakmo-Drupa dynasty made his position untenable and he had to cross the Himalayas into Bhutan with his students and his understanding and very little else. Rigpa does not require the cave. It does not require the silence, or the altitude, or the morning light at a specific angle, or the absence of institutional pressure, or the presence of the teacher, or the completion of the text. These conditions are useful. They create the space in which recognition is more likely to occur. But they are not Rigpa itself. Rigpa is what is present before any condition arrives and after any condition dissolves. It is the awareness that noticed the cold of the first winter morning in the cave and the warmth of the first spring morning and every quality of light at every hour through all the years at Gangri Thoka. And that is in no way diminished by the fact that those years ended and the cave was left behind and the mountain continued its long endurance without any human presence to notice it. This matters tonight because you, too, are in conditions that did not fully choose you and that you did not fully choose. The dark of this room, the particular hour, the particular quality of the mind's activity right now, the thoughts present, the concerns that have not resolved, the body that may or may not be comfortable in the position it has found. All of these are conditions, and what is noticing them, the bare awareness that is present to whatever is arising in this moment, is not a condition. It does not come and go with the thoughts. It does not improve when circumstances improve or diminish when circumstances are difficult. It is present in the anxiety as fully as it is present in the relief. This is the recognition that Longchenpa spent his life in caves and poverty and exile trying to find language for, that the nature of mind is not something you achieve when conditions become favorable enough. It is something you recognize when you stop demanding that conditions be different before you allow yourself to recognize it. The cave is sufficient. The darkness is sufficient. The hour is sufficient. What is aware in this moment has been aware through every moment that preceded it, through every difficult night and every impossible situation and every version of the future that did not arrive as feared, and it is here now, unchanged, present. The same awareness that was present before the first thought of tonight arrived and will be present after the last thought of tonight dissolves. you have not lost what matters. Rigpa cannot be taken in a political upheaval. It cannot be left behind when the cave is abandoned. It cannot fail to arrive in the morning with the light. It is the light's witness, the awareness that notices the light arriving, which is not the light, which is not the cave, which is not the morning or the night or any of the conditions that come and go while it remains. It is here now, in this room, in this breath, in this moment of the dark that is simply dark and does not need to be anything else for what is aware of it to be fully present within it. The cave at Gangri Turka is still there. The rock is the same rock. The east-facing entrance still receives the morning light in the same specific quality that Longchenpa's writing was composed by. The silver precision of high-altitude winter dawn touching the stone floor and moving across it as the sun moves. Patient, indifferent to whether anyone is there to notice it. Whether or not anyone is there to notice it, the light arrives. Whether or not the mind is quiet enough to recognize it, Rigpa is present. Let the breath move now without any management of its moving. Let it arrive the way the morning light arrives at the cave's entrance, not because anyone has arranged the conditions correctly, but because that is its nature. Because that is what it does when nothing prevents it. The cold does not prevent it. The dark does not prevent it. The unresolved thoughts of this hour do not prevent it. It moves because moving is what it does. The awareness that is noticing this breath is not troubled by this breath. The awareness that is noticing the darkness of this room is not darkened by the darkness. The awareness that is noticing whatever thoughts are present is not the thoughts. It is the space in which the thoughts appear as wide as the sky above Gangri Turka, as unmoved by what passes through it as the mountain is unmoved by the weather that crosses its ridge year after year after year. Just this awareness, present, just this breath, arriving, just this moment of the cave, regardless of what the cave is made of stone, of night, of the particular hour and the particular quality of the dark that belongs to this specific moment of the world. The light will come. It always has. It comes whether or not the recognition happened tonight. It comes whether or not the text was finished or the understanding transmitted or the next generation was ready to receive it. It comes because that is its nature. And nature does not require our gratitude or our acknowledgement to continue being what it is. Rest now. The cave is sufficient. The night is sufficient. What is aware of these things is sufficient, has always been sufficient, whether or not it has been recognized as such until this moment. And as the White Skull Mountain fades behind us, as the juniper roots and the east-facing entrance and the silver morning light dissolve back into the stone they came from, we make our last movement in these stories, southward from Tibet, into the warmth of the Thai forest, where a man sits alone before the dawn breaks, in the last hour of the night before the birds begin, where there is no story left to tell, only breath, only forest, only the long patience of a practice that has been doing this sitting with the dark, waiting for no particular arrival for every night of a very long life. If you are drifting, you have already arrived. Let the rest come without you needing to be awake for it. Before the birds begin, the forest of northeast Thailand holds a particular quality of dark. It is not the dark of a room with the curtains drawn, the dark of urban night with its ambient glow at the edges. It is the dark of a place that has no artificial light within several kilometers, where the only illumination comes from the stars when the canopy opens enough to show them, and from the occasional phosphorescence of fallen wood, the soft, cold glow that organic matter produces when the conditions are exactly right. Visible only to eyes that have been in complete darkness long enough to open fully to what is there. The forest floor of Isan, in the dry season, is a different texture from the rainy season's mat of decomposed leaf and exposed root. In November and December, the leaves that have fallen since the last rains are still themselves not yet broken down, holding their shapes but losing their color. A particular pale golden brown that in daylight gives the forest floor a warmth that the trees above do not share. In darkness, this warmth is not visible. What is present instead is the smell of it, the dry leaf smell of the Isan forest in cool season. Particular and clean, carrying the trace of the laterite soil beneath and the particular quality of a landscape that receives its moisture in a single season and then waits through months of dry air for the cycle to turn again. The air in the pre-dawn forest, before any warmth has come back into it from the night's accumulated cold, is very still. The stillness is not the absence of sound. The Isan forest is never silent. The insect chorus, maintaining through every dark hour a sustained presence that the ear eventually stops registering as sound in the conventional sense and begins to register as a quality of the air itself, the way one registers the feel of fabric or the temperature of water. Something that is simply the condition of the environment rather than an event occurring within it. In the hour before dawn, this sustained sound is at its fullest, the peak of the insect voices, before the birds' first calls begin to layer over them and the sound begins its daily transition from the night register to the day register. In this forest, in this dark, in this particular quality of still air and insect sound and dry leaf smell, a man is sitting. He has been sitting here for most of the night. His robe is the patched and faded ochre of a monk who does not replace cloth until the current cloth has been used past any reasonable definition of usefulness. He is in his mid-70s, and his body carries the particular quality of a body that has been deliberately used rather than preserved, the leanness of someone who eats once a day. The straightness of a back that has maintained the meditation posture for thousands of hours across 5 decades of practice. His hands rest in his lap. His eyes are neither fully open nor fully closed. His breathing is slow enough that in the darkness it would be difficult to detect without approaching very closely. And no one is approaching. He is not doing anything. This is the thing about the final dissolution. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a conclusion, a summary, a gathering of all that has been learned into a final formulation. It is not the opposite of the beginning. It is simply where the practice arrives when it has been going long enough, a quality of presence so complete that the distinction between practicing and not practicing, between doing and not doing, between the person who sits in the forest and the forest itself, has become difficult to maintain with any conviction. The breath moves. Each breath is the same breath the body has been breathing since the first breath of this life, not the same air, not the same measurement of oxygen and nitrogen and trace elements, but the same gesture, the same motion of expansion and release that has been occurring since before he had any name for it, since before he knew there was something happening called breathing. The breath he is breathing now, in this forest, before the birds begin, is not different in any essential way from the breath he breathed in the village of Bang Kam Bong when he was 7 years old. Watching his grandmother recite prayers he did not yet understand. The breath does not improve with practice. It simply continues. A teak leaf falls from somewhere above. It makes its particular sound against the other leaves on the descent a very small sound. The sound of something very light moving through a medium, slightly more resistant than air, and then settles with the finality of something that has arrived at its place and will not be moving further. The insect sound continues. Somewhere to the north, perhaps 40 meters into the dark, an animal moves through the undergrowth with a deliberateness that suggests it has a destination rather than a direction. The sound lasts for perhaps 30 seconds and then is gone. The breath moves. Something in the body has been releasing slowly through the hours of sitting, not a specific tension, nothing that can be located precisely, but the general held quality of a body that has been carrying the weight of a life through decades of effort. The forest does not ask anything of the body. The earth beneath the sitting position does not ask anything. The air moving through the lungs does not ask anything. In this not asking, something releases that cannot be named. In the same way that the teak leaf cannot tell you why this hour and not another was the hour of its falling. The temperature of the air is at its lowest now, in the pre-dawn. The coolness is the clean coolness of tropical dry season, not the wet cold of monsoon air, but the dry coolness of air that has given up its moisture over the long clear night and is now simply cool. The pure temperature of a sky that has been open to the stars for 8 hours. Against the skin of the hands and the face, this coolness is neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It is simply the temperature of the air at this hour, in this place. It does not require evaluation. The stars above the canopy gap to the east are fading, very slightly, as the sky lightens in a direction rather than a place, as though the light is approaching from a great distance and has not yet arrived, but is already changing the quality of the dark. The insect sound continues its long, sustained note. The breath moves. This is all there is. In this moment, the breath, the insect sound, the dry leaf smell, the particular quality of sitting that a body achieves after a long night in one position, not comfortable, not uncomfortable, simply the position the body has arrived at through its own settling, through the gradual release of all the small muscular adjustments that the first hours of sitting require, until what remains is simply the body, held by the earth, in the dark, breathing. The sky above the canopy is not quite as dark as it was an hour ago. The change is not visible in any single moment. It does not happen in a moment. It happens in the accumulation of moments, each one indistinguishable from the last, but the accumulation measurable. The darkness is becoming a darkness with a direction to it slightly lighter to the east, where the horizon is, where the sun will eventually appear without any particular drama and begin the day's work of illuminating what the night does not illuminate. He has watched this transition many thousands of times. In Isan forests, and in caves in Nakhon Nayok, and in the mountain forests of Chiang Mai, and in the lowland jungles of Lao, and in the hill tribe villages of the northern ranges, where the air at this hour smells of pine and wood smoke from Tem, the previous night's fires. He has watched the skies transition from one quality of dark to another quality of dark, to the first imperceptible lightning that is not yet dawn, but is the knowledge of dawn in all of these places. In all of these seasons, across 50 years of mornings. And each time it has been this: the sky moving without being asked to, the light returning without requiring permission, the world resuming its visible form as it always has, regardless of what occurred during the night, regardless of who was awake to observe it. The practice is not the sitting. The sitting is one form the practice takes. The practice is what continues through the sitting and the walking and the eating of the one daily meal and the mending of the robe and the acceptance of alms from the farmer's wife who has walked 2 kilometers to offer rice at the daily forest's edge. The practice is what the body carries without the mind's involvement. in the way the heart carries its rhythm without the mind's instruction. He stopped distinguishing between practice and not practice some years ago. At approximately the same time that he stopped being certain, he could say where the forest ended and the sitting monk began. The birds begin. First one, a single call from somewhere in the middle canopy, short and repeated at intervals. Then a second, different voice, from a different direction. Then a third. Then the forest's particular morning cacophony assembles itself over the course of 10 or 15 minutes. The way the insect voices assembled themselves at dusk, but in the opposite order, not the layering on of voices as darkness deepened, but the layering on of voices as light arrives. Each species taking up its position in the day's sound as the light takes up its position in the day's sky. He does not move. He does not open his eyes more fully or shift his position in response to the sound. The sound is what the forest does in the morning. He is what he is in the morning. These two facts coexist without either requiring the other to be different. The breath moves. This is the whole of it. Not the conclusion of 10 stories. Not the resolution of the uncertainty that began when you lay down tonight. Not the answer to the question the dark has been asking. Simply this, a body breathing in a forest before the dawn, for no reason other than that breathing is what the body does. And sitting is what this particular body has done in forests for 50 years. And the forest continues to be the forest, whether or not there is someone sitting in it. And the breath continues to move, whether or not anyone is attending to it. You do not need to find this. You are already in it. The breath moving in the body resting in the dark is the whole forest, the insect sound. The teak leaf arriving at its place. The sky beginning its turn toward morning. You are not listening to a story about this. You are this. The breath. The dark. The body held by what holds it. The awareness present to all of this without requiring any of it to be different. Just this breath. Let it move without your help. Let it move the way the sky moves toward morning without being asked, without anyone managing the transition, simply because that is what it does when nothing prevents it. The birds are singing now. Let them sing. The dawn is coming. Let it come. The breath is moving. Let it move. You don't need to stay awake for the morning. The morning will arrive whether you are awake for it or not. The forest knows how to make a day without your participation. The breath knows how to continue. The body knows how to be held. Let go. Let go of staying awake. Let go of following the story. Let go of knowing where you are in the dark. The breath is here. The body is held. The forest is doing what forests do at the end of the night. You have arrived. You have always been here. The breath will carry you the rest of the way. Just this. Just this. Just this. Tonight we have traveled to places that rarely appear in the English language, to a cave on the White Skull Mountain of Tibet, to a cold stone workshop above a Mongolian valley, to the forests of Cambodia and the construction site of an island temple in Java, to a Korean hermitage wrapped in barbed wire, to a mountain in Vietnam where a king arrived at midnight with nothing left to protect, to a forest in northeast Thailand where a man sat until the birds began. These are not the famous stories. I search for them specifically because they live at the edges of what most people know, and because, in my experience, the teachings that reach deepest are are often the ones we have never been prepared for. None of these traditions used the same words for what they were pointing toward, but they were all pointing toward the same clearing, the understanding that the uncertainty you are carrying tonight does not need to resolve before rest is allowed. That the not knowing is not the gap in the floor. It is the floor itself, the only floor there actually is. The floor that everyone stands on, that has always held everything that has ever stood on it. You do not need to understand the teachings to receive what they carry. You do not need to remember the names of the mountains or the monks or the centuries. Understanding and remembering were never the point. The breath is the point. The body held in the dark is the point. The awareness that is present right now, in this room, noticing whatever is here, that is the point. And it has been present through every story, through every tradition, through every language that has ever tried to say the unsayable. Let the details go. Let the names dissolve. Let the stories return to the silence they came from. What remains is what was always here, the breath, moving, the awareness, present, the night, holding you the way it holds. Everyone who has ever lain down in the dark, not knowing what tomorrow would bring, and been carried through to morning anyway. Personal voice, approximately 15-20 seconds of spoken narration. I've spent a long time with these particular stories and these particular teachers. Longer than expected. If I'm honest, they found me at moments when I needed exactly what they were offering. I hope something in tonight found you in the same way. If this video has been a companion through a difficult night, or if it found you at a moment when the uncertainty felt heavier than usual, I would genuinely love to know. Leave a comment, or simply like the video so others who need this can find it. Not for the numbers, because the people who make it to the end of a 3-hour video about not knowing are exactly the people I want more of on this channel. You are enough. You have always been enough. The not knowing does not change that. Sleep now. The morning will come regardless. You have arrived.